Family Guy has been called offensive since the night it premiered. Most people think every scandal ended the same way. A complaint, a small cut, a network apology. 400 episodes in, almost nothing has ever truly been stopped. Almost. A Fox executive once said, the only banned episode was actually handled well. This is Family Guy's biggest scandals. The show that almost wasn't Seth MacFarlane was 23 years old when he walked into a Fox executive's office and performed, from memory, an entire animated series. Voices, story beats, jokes, characters, all of it, right there in the room. He had grown up in Kent, Connecticut, drawn cartoons obsessively as a child, gone to the Rhode Island School of Design to study film animation, and graduated in 1995 with a short film about a man and his talking dog. That short was good enough to get him a job writing for Hanna-Barbera, where he worked on shows like Johnny Bravo and Cow and Chicken. And it was there, somewhere between scripts and late-night studio hours, that the idea for what would become Family Guy started to take real shape. The pitch itself has become one of those legendary Hollywood stories. MacFarlane walked in to see Fox's president of alternative programming with an animatic, a kind of rough animated sketch that he had put together for around $40,000 in development money. Except he had not spent just the development money. He had maxed out credit cards, burned through personal savings, and delivered something far beyond what anyone expected. Instead of a few rough minutes of animation to get a feel for the idea, he came back with something close to a full pilot. The executive, Mike Darnell, later said he was not sure if the young man sitting across from him was crazy or brilliant, and that he eventually concluded it was the latter. MacFarlane was given the green light to produce 13 episodes. The show premiered on January 31st, 1999, immediately following Super Bowl III. That slot was not an accident. Fox knew that a post-Super Bowl audience was enormous, and putting a brand new animated comedy in that window was the network's way of giving it a genuine chance to land. And land it did, at least that night. Around 22 million viewers watched the first episode of Family Guy. For a brand new show nobody had heard of, that was a staggering number. It seemed like Fox had something on its hands. What followed over the next 3 years was one of the stranger stories in American television history. A show that debuted in front of 22 million people would, within 4 years, be canceled not once but twice, and then come back stronger than anything the network had imagined. The path between that enormous premiere and that eventual resurrection is where the first real controversy of the show's life lives. Because Family Guy's early trouble was not purely creative. Much of it was logistical, political, and entirely self-inflicted by Fox, which kept making scheduling decisions that put the show in impossible positions and then blamed the show for the consequences. The first season ran for 7 episodes, most of which aired on Sundays. That was a comfortable spot. Sundays after The Simpsons was the kind of placement a new comedy would dream about. The show had a built-in audience flowing in from one of the most established animated series in television history, and it performed well enough in that slot to justify a renewal. Season 2 was ordered, and it looked like Family Guy was on solid ground. Then Fox moved it. The second season began airing on Thursday nights in the fall of 1999, which put it directly against Frasier on NBC. Frasier was, at that point, one of the most watched comedies on television. Putting a new, unproven animated show up against it was not a scheduling decision that made much sense. Ratings suffered immediately. Fox then began bouncing the show around its schedule, which only made things worse. A show cannot build a reliable audience when its time slot keeps changing, and Family Guy's numbers continued to fall throughout the second season. By the spring of 2000, it had landed on Tuesdays, opposite Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, which was at that moment one of the biggest shows on American television. The ratings collapse was almost total. By May of 2000, Fox canceled the show after 2 seasons. The cancellation lasted only a few months. Fox reversed its decision almost immediately, ordering a shorter third season of 13 episodes. MacFarlane later described getting that call from the network as surreal, the kind of phone call where the person on the other end seemed almost apologetic about the fact that the show had been canceled in the first place. Season 3 began airing in July of 2001, and Fox put it in the worst possible slot yet. Thursdays at 8 in the evening, directly opposite Friends. Friends was, at that particular moment in American television, essentially untouchable. It was the most watched show of the season, drawing enormous audiences every week. And then, in September of 2001, the country's entire cultural landscape shifted with the September 11th attacks, and television viewership patterns changed along with everything else. Family Guy's already fragile ratings fell further. CBS's Survivor was also pulling massive numbers at the same time. Between Friends, Survivor, and the broader disruption of the season, Family Guy had no room to breathe. Fox canceled the show again in 2002, this time leaving a produced episode without a time slot, an episode that would eventually air on Adult Swim without ever touching a Fox broadcast. The second cancellation felt final. MacFarlane did not have much reason to believe otherwise. The show had been canceled twice, its ratings had never recovered from the scheduling decisions of the second season, and there was no obvious reason for Fox to bring it back. He moved on to developing other ideas, met with network executives regularly, pitched new projects, and spent the next few years trying to figure out what came next. American Dad grew out of that period, developed partly as something MacFarlane could work on while the memory of Family Guy's cancellation was still fresh. The thinking at the time was not that Family Guy would return. The thinking was that MacFarlane needed something else. What happened instead is a story that the television industry had genuinely never seen before. Family Guy came back, and it came back because of DVD sales and cable reruns. Not because of a network decision, not because of a critical reevaluation, not because of a petition or a letter-writing campaign. Actual retail sales of physical discs, combined with late-night cable airings, rebuilt the audience that Fox's scheduling decisions had destroyed. The DVD releases of the first 2 seasons arrived in April 2003, divided into 2 volumes. They sold extraordinarily well, outpacing almost every other television-based DVD release that year, including releases from shows that were still actively on the air. Millions of copies moved in a matter of months. At the same time, Turner Broadcasting's Adult Swim block on Cartoon Network had acquired the rights to air reruns of Family Guy, and it was running them late at night to strong ratings. The combination created something unusual, a show that was canceled but appearing to grow in popularity precisely because it was no longer on television. The freedom of DVD and late-night cable meant the episodes could be seen without the pressure of a specific time slot, and people were finding them that way. Fox noticed the numbers. More than 2 million DVD units had sold within a year of release, and the Adult Swim ratings were strong enough to raise eyebrows at the network. MacFarlane, by his own account, had begun dropping by the office of Fox's chairman of television with the same message after every meeting: the show needs to come back. Finally, in late 2003, Fox confirmed it was in talks with MacFarlane to revive the series. By early 2004, the deal was done, and in May 2005, Family Guy Season 4 premiered on Fox in the Sunday night slot after The Simpsons, the same slot where the show had first found its footing 6 years earlier. The revival was treated as a kind of miracle, and for good reason. No show had ever come back from cancellation purely on the strength of its home video sales. The precedent it set was significant, and it was noticed across the entire industry. It changed how networks thought about canceled shows, how studios thought about DVD releases, and how both of them thought about the relationship between a show's broadcast audience and the wider market of people who might want to watch it outside of a live television slot. But within that story of recovery, there is a detail worth sitting with. The show that returned in 2005 was not the same show that had been canceled in 2002. The audience that brought it back had found it on their own terms, watching episodes at times and in conditions that felt different from regular broadcast television. They had found it late at night on cable, or on DVD in someone's living room, or on a laptop. Family Guy had, during its period of cancellation, become something closer to a cult object, and the show that came back in 2005 seemed to know that. It pushed harder, went darker, took more risks. The early seasons had already pushed boundaries in ways that got the show in trouble with watchdog groups and advertisers. What came after the revival was bolder still. There is also something worth understanding about who Seth MacFarlane was by the time the revival aired. When Family Guy premiered in 1999, he was 24 years old and the youngest executive producer of a major network primetime show in television history. That fact was noted often in the press at the time, usually as a kind of shorthand for the show's irreverence and energy. MacFarlane was young, he was ambitious, and he had built the show almost entirely from his own imagination, voicing multiple characters himself and writing or overseeing the writing of most of the episodes. Brian the dog, Peter Griffin, Stewie Griffin, and Quagmire were all his voice. The show was deeply personal to him in a way that most network comedies are not, and that personal investment made the cancellations especially hard. He spoke about the experience of being canceled twice in later interviews with a kind of careful understatement that did not fully disguise how difficult the period had been. Getting a show on the air is extraordinarily difficult under any circumstances. Getting it canceled and then revived and then canceled again, all within a few years, while maintaining the energy and focus to keep developing new material, is a different kind of challenge entirely. MacFarlane managed it, and the version of Family Guy that came back from that experience was sharper and more combative than the one that had gone away. Fox, for its part, handled the revival announcement with something that MacFarlane later described as a desire to ease the show back onto the schedule quietly, without drawing too much attention to the fact that it had been canceled and was now returning. The phrase he used to describe the network's approach was sneaking it back into production, which gives some sense of the internal uncertainty at Fox about whether the revival would work. The network was not entirely sure it was making the right call. It made it anyway, in part because the DVD sales numbers were impossible to ignore, and in part because MacFarlane's contract with Fox was still active, and the terms of that contract made the revival financially straightforward. What the network could not have predicted was quite how much of a cultural force Family Guy would become over the following 2 decades. The show that had been canceled twice, the show that had been beaten in the ratings by a game show and a reality competition, went on to run for more than 20 seasons. It was nominated for the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series in 2009, becoming only the second animated show to receive that nomination domination after the Flintstones nearly 50 years earlier. It generated multiple spin-offs, an enormous merchandise business, and a fan base that showed no signs of losing interest. All of that came after the revival. Before the revival, Family Guy was a canceled show that people were watching on DVD and cable because they liked it enough to seek it out on their own. That distinction matters. The show earned its second life not because a network decided it deserved one, but because enough individual people decided they wanted to keep watching it without being told to. That is an unusual thing in the history of television, and it is the foundation on which everything that came after was built. The controversies that would follow over the next 20 years, the banned episodes, the lawsuits, the FCC complaints, the backlash from politicians and advocacy groups, all of that grew from a show that had already proven it could survive being killed. Having come back from 2 cancellations, Family Guy had very little to lose by pushing harder and going further, and it did exactly that. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Coming up, the first episode Fox refused to let anyone see, and the 4 years it spent locked away before anyone outside the writer's room got to watch it. Section 2. The episode Fox buried for 4 years. Fox pulled the episode before anyone outside the building had even seen it. No complaint had been filed, no watchdog group had caught wind of it, no politician had called for action. The network simply looked at a finished, fully produced episode that its own money had paid for, decided the risk of airing it was too high, and quietly removed it from the broadcast schedule. That episode was called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. It had been written, animated, and delivered in the year 2000, during Family Guy's second season. It would not air on American television for more than 4 years. The episode was written by Ricky Blitt, a Jewish writer on the show's staff. That detail matters because MacFarlane later pointed out that roughly 70% of the writing room was Jewish at the time, a fact he brought up specifically when responding to the suggestion that the episode was anti-Semitic. The story centers on Peter Griffin losing the family's savings to a scam involving volcano insurance, which is exactly the kind of financial decision Peter is built to make. His friends Cleveland and Quagmire, both doing reasonably well for themselves, mentioned that they use Jewish accountants. Peter, whose understanding of how the world works is essentially that of a confident and completely uninformed 8-year-old, concludes that Jewish people are simply better with money by nature, and that what he needs is one of his own. He prays to find a Jewish person, ends up befriending a man named Max Weinstein, played by Ben Stein, and then, in a leap of logic that makes sense only to Peter, decides the real solution is to convert his son Chris to Judaism so that the religion itself will make Chris successful in life. Lois spends the episode pushing back on all of this. She makes the straightforward point that a person's religion has nothing to do with their financial ability, that Peter is being ridiculous, and that dragging Chris into a bar mitzvah he has not chosen or understood is not a plan. Peter, as usual, does not listen to her until the episode has run its course and the lesson arrives. The moral is clear enough. Peter was wrong, stereotypes are not reality, and his attempt to use religion as a shortcut was both foolish and offensive. The joke was always meant to be on Peter, not on Jewish people. MacFarlane was careful enough about the episode's reception that he showed the script to 2 rabbis before delivering it to the network. Both of them read it and approved it. Their reasoning, which MacFarlane mentioned in the DVD commentary, was that Peter reaches the right conclusion by the end. Whatever the journey looked like, the destination was not endorsement of the stereotype. That endorsement from 2 religious scholars did not move Fox executives enough to put the episode on the air. The network looked at the content, weighed the potential for negative press against the cost of sitting on the episode, and chose to sit on it. The caution that drove that decision was not unique to Family Guy. Television networks in the early 2000s routinely made exactly this kind of calculation, shelving content that sat anywhere near a controversy they were not prepared to defend. The math was simple. If the episode airs and nobody complains, you gained nothing over not airing it. If the episode airs and someone complains loudly, you have a problem. If you just do not air it, the problem does not exist. That logic is cowardly but not irrational, and it shaped broadcast decisions at every major network throughout the era. Fox applied it here, and When You Wish Upon a Weinstein disappeared into a vault while the show continued around it. The episode missed the rest of the second season, missed the abbreviated third season that followed, and was still locked away when the show was canceled for the second time in 2002. By the time it surfaced publicly, Family Guy had been off the air for over a year. The DVD release of the third season in September 2003 was the first time anyone outside the production could actually watch it, included in the set without any particular fanfare. Then Adult Swim aired it on November 9th, 2003, with minor adjustments for that broadcast context. Fox finally showed a version of it on December 10th, 2004, more than 4 years after the episode had been completed. 4 years for an episode that most people who eventually watched it found somewhere between mildly amusing and entirely harmless. The Fox broadcast was not the same as the DVD version. The most notable difference was in the episode's central musical number, a song Peter performs called I Need a Jew, set to the melody of the classic Disney song When You Wish Upon a Star. In the original cut, the song moves through several verses before landing on a lyric that connects Peter's gratitude toward Jewish people to his Christian beliefs about the crucifixion. That line was removed from the Fox broadcast. The DVD version kept it intact, and over time, streaming platforms restored the original as well. The change was small in terms of screen time, but revealing in terms of where Fox's discomfort actually sat. The executives were not worried about the whole episode. They were worried about particular lines, particular combinations of words that could be clipped out of context and used against the network. That concern turned out to be prescient, though not in the way Fox imagined. The song created its own legal trouble, separate from the broadcast decision, when a music publishing company called Born Co. filed a federal lawsuit in October 2007. Born Co. held the copyright to the original When You Wish Upon a Star, the song from Pinocchio that the show had borrowed its melody from. The lawsuit named Fox, Seth MacFarlane, the show's composer Walter Murphy, and Cartoon Network as defendants. Born's argument was that I Need a Jew was not a legitimate parody of When You Wish Upon a Star, and therefore was not protected under copyright law's fair use provisions. The legal distinction at the center of the case is one that copyright law takes seriously. A parody, in legal terms, borrows from an original work in order to comment on that original work itself. A satire borrows from an original work to comment on something else entirely. Parody gets stronger legal protection because the borrowing is considered necessary. You cannot comment on a song without using the song. Satire gets weaker protection because the borrowed material is just a vehicle, and a different vehicle could theoretically have served the same purpose. Born's argument was that I Need a Jew was satirizing Peter Griffin and anti-Semitic stereotypes, not commenting on When You Wish Upon a Star, which would make it satire rather than parody and potentially expose it to liability. The defense countered that the song was genuinely commenting on its source material. When You Wish Upon a Star is built around a particular emotional worldview, innocent, hopeful, magical in its logic. The idea that wishing hard enough can make things come true. I Need a Jew takes that exact framework and runs it through Peter's specific ignorance, turning the wishing structure of the original into a vehicle for ethnic stereotyping and magical thinking about race and religion. The contrast between the saccharine sweetness of the original and the bluntness of what Peter is doing with that same melody was itself a comment on the original's worldview. The defense also raised the fact that Walt Disney himself had a documented personal history of anti-Semitism, making the choice to use a Disney song for this particular joke something more than coincidence. Beyond the legal argument, the production team made another point. MacFarlane's team had actually approached Born Co. before the episode aired and asked for permission to use the melody. Born said no. The decision to proceed anyway was a calculated one, based on the belief that the use qualified as fair use regardless of whether the rights holder approved. A federal judge in New York agreed with that assessment. In March 2009, the court ruled in favor of Family Guy, finding that the song qualified as parody under copyright law, that it commented on the source material through contrast and context, and that no infringement had occurred. Born received nothing, and the ruling stood. The Born lawsuit was actually the second time in 2 years the show had ended up in federal court. In March 2007, comedian Carol Burnett filed a $6 million lawsuit against Fox, arguing that a brief scene in a Family Guy episode had used a version of her famous Charwoman character without permission, violating her trademark and her right to control her own image. The scene placed the character in a setting Burnett found degrading, specifically inside an adult entertainment establishment. Her lawyers argued that the use went beyond the protections of parody and crossed into unauthorized exploitation of her likeness. A federal judge dismissed the case in June 2007, ruling that the parody protection under the First Amendment applied even though the original character was clearly more creative and distinctive than what Family Guy had done with it. Burnett appealed, but the dismissal held. 2 lawsuits in 2 years, both losses for the parties suing. The pattern suggested something about how aggressively the show was operating in the space between borrowing and theft, between satire and defamation, between parody and exploitation. MacFarlane and Fox were drawing on existing cultural material constantly, remixing it, inverting it, placing it in context that the original creators had never imagined and often deeply resented. The legal system kept siding with them, on the grounds that parody and satire are constitutionally protected forms of expression. But the lawsuits themselves revealed that the show was producing content that real people and real companies felt genuinely harmed by, regardless of what the courts eventually decided. Back in the context of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, all of that legal drama followed from a network decision made in 2000 out of simple fear. When the episode finally reached audiences on Adult Swim in late 2003, the response was largely quiet. Critics who had heard about the Locked Away episode for years arrived expecting something genuinely incendiary and left with something much more moderate. One writer at the Jewish newspaper The Forward concluded that the episode was not necessarily demeaning to Jewish people, but found it too thin and unfocused to be particularly funny. That kind of lukewarm assessment, not a condemnation, not a defense, just mild disappointment at the gap between reputation and reality, was roughly where most critical responses landed. No major Jewish advocacy group issued a formal condemnation. No advertiser boycott materialized. No FCC complaint was filed over the content. The episode aired on Adult Swim, then on Fox, and then became a standard part of the show's catalog. Eventually, eventually available on streaming services in its original uncut form. The rabbis who had approved the script presumably never heard another word about it. Fox's caution, which had seemed commercially rational in 2000, looked increasingly like an overreaction by 2004, though by then, the decision was 4 years old and the network had moved on to worrying about whatever Family Guy was doing that week. What the episode's history actually illustrated was the gap between how executives imagine controversy and how it tends to arrive. The assumption in 2000 was that someone would see the episode, identify it as anti-Semitic, and create enough noise to damage the network. That sequence never happened. What did happen was a lawsuit over a melody from Pinocchio and a separate lawsuit from Carol Burnett over a character in a strip club, neither of which anyone at Fox had thought to worry about when they were pulling When You Wish Upon a Weinstein from the schedule. The actual controversies were different in shape from the anticipated ones, a fact that would remain true throughout the show's entire run. Family Guy kept generating genuine backlash, but rarely over the things that anyone had decided in advance to worry about. The episode is sometimes called the show's first banned episode, though that label is not quite accurate. Fox never used the word banned internally. The show was not told the episode could not be made. It was made, delivered, and then not scheduled, a distinction that sounds technical but matters in practice. A banned episode is one someone decides should not exist. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was an episode someone decided should not be shown yet, and then that delay extended until a combination of DVD sales, Adult Swim ratings, and the show's revival made the whole question moot. The second genuinely banned episode, the one that has never aired on American television for any reason at any time, would come 8 seasons later. That one was a different matter entirely. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Fox pulled that episode based on a fear that turned out to be bigger than the actual reaction. The next controversy was different. A single scene from a different episode ended up connecting the show's creator to one of the worst days in American history. Section 3. The scene that connected Family Guy to September 11. Sometime in the spring of 2000, a Family Guy writing room came up with a joke about Osama bin Laden singing a show tune in an airport. The episode it went into, Road to Rhode Island, aired on May 30th, 2000, about 16 months before the September 11th attacks. Nobody flagged the joke as especially sensitive at the time. Bin Laden had been publicly identified by the United States government as a terrorist and a threat since at least 1996, following bombings at American embassies in Africa. His name was known, his organization was known, but in the spring of 2000, he had not yet done the thing that would make his name impossible to say casually on American television for the better part of a decade. So the joke aired, the episode moved on, and for about a year nothing came of it. Then September 11 happened, and the scene became something else entirely. The Road to Rhode Island is widely considered one of the best episodes Family Guy ever made. Seth MacFarlane has called it his personal favorite. The premise is straightforward. Brian volunteers to pick up Stewie from his grandparents' house in Palm Springs. The two of them miss their flight home, and the episode follows their cross-country journey back to Quahog. Along the way, Brian confronts some painful truths about his mother. Stewie manipulates and schemes as he always does, and the two characters develop the dynamic that would define their relationship for the rest of the series. The road trip format gave the show room to breathe in a way that the usual Quahog setting did not, and the episode's combination of genuine emotion and sharp comedy made it stand out from almost everything around it. Critics who revisited the early seasons consistently placed it at or near the top. The Osama bin Laden scene comes during the airport sequence at the beginning of the episode. Stewie, approaching the security checkpoint, realizes his carry-on luggage is full of weapons. Rather than panic, he breaks into a song from a children's film, performing it loudly enough to distract the security officers from examining his bag through the X-ray machine. The tactic works. As Stewie congratulates himself, he mutters that the plan only succeeds because Osama bin Laden does not know show tunes. At that exact moment, the episode cuts to bin Laden in a separate line at the same airport, performing a different show tune for the same purpose, smuggling his own bag through security with the same cheerful misdirection. The joke lands on the absurdity of the image, a known terrorist deploying Broadway as a weapon, and moves on within seconds. In May 2000, that was a fairly typical piece of Family Guy irreverence. The show had already established that nothing was too sensitive for a quick joke, and bin Laden was a public figure associated with violence and extremism in a way that made him fair game for the same kind of satirical treatment the show applied to politicians, celebrities, and historical figures. The joke was not particularly deep. It was quick, visual, and moved immediately to the next beat. Audiences who saw the original broadcast mostly laughed or shrugged, and the episode's more emotionally resonant moments, particularly the storyline about Brian's complicated feelings about his mother, were what most people took away from it. 16 months later, the entire context around that 30-second scene changed overnight. On the morning of September 11, 2001, Seth MacFarlane was booked on American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston to Los Angeles. The flight was scheduled to depart at 7:45 in the morning. MacFarlane had been in Boston the night before, giving a lecture at his college alma mater, and then going out with faculty members afterward. He had had a few drinks, stayed out later than he should have, and woke up the next morning with a hangover and a compromised sense of time. His travel agent had also made a mistake on his itinerary, listing the flight's departure as 8:15 rather than 7:45, a 30-minute discrepancy that turned out to matter enormously. McFarlane arrived at Logan Airport approximately 10 minutes after the gate had closed. The agent at the counter told him he was too late, and he rebooked on the next available flight, then went into the airport lounge and fell asleep. He woke up about 45 minutes later to noise and commotion around him. American Airlines Flight 11 had been hijacked and flown into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, killing everyone on board. McFarlane was sitting in an airport lounge watching it happen on a television screen, knowing he had been booked on that plane and had missed it by minutes. He turned to the person next to him and said he had been supposed to be on that flight. The bartender, when McFarlane told him, poured him a drink on the spot. He called his assistant to explain what had happened, but the message did not get through for nearly 20 minutes after the crash, leaving people who knew his itinerary believing he had been on the plane. When the confirmation finally came that he had missed the flight, the relief for those around him was the kind that follows a very close call at very high speed. McFarlane later sent his travel agent a basket of alcohol as a thank you, acknowledging that her scheduling mistake had almost certainly saved his life. The hangover from the night before played a role too. He has said so in multiple interviews, and it is difficult to imagine him telling that story without a particular awareness of how strange the chain of events looks in retrospect. Actor Mark Wahlberg had also been booked on Flight 11 that morning, changing his plans the day before due to a last-minute invitation to the Toronto Film Festival. The two men, both connected to the flight, both in Boston the night before, both departing for Los Angeles, ended up not being on it for completely different reasons. McFarlane through accident and exhaustion, Wahlberg through a schedule change. The coincidence is the kind of thing that does not seem real when listed plainly. McFarlane has spoken about the experience in interviews across many years, and his approach to it has been notably measured rather than dramatic. He has consistently resisted the idea that his survival carried special meaning or that he was somehow destined to live. His position, stated more than once, is that close calls happen constantly, and most of them go unnoticed because the near miss only becomes visible when something terrible actually happens nearby. The flight he was supposed to be on crashed. That made his near miss visible. If the flight had landed normally in Los Angeles, the fact that he almost missed it would have been nothing, a minor travel inconvenience forgotten by lunchtime. What all of that personal history means for the airport scene in Road to Rhode Island is something that is almost impossible to untangle cleanly. McFarlane had written and produced a scene in which Osama bin Laden slips weapons past airport security by singing a show tune. The scene aired in May 2000. 16 months later, bin Laden's organization killed nearly 3,000 people, partly by exploiting gaps in airport security. McFarlane, who produced the scene, had been booked on one of the planes used in those attacks and missed it by minutes. The connections between those facts are real but not causal. McFarlane did not predict the attacks. The show did not predict the attacks. The bin Laden joke was a coincidence that became unbearable to watch in context, not a prophecy. Fox made the decision to cut the scene from reruns shortly after September 11th. The choice was essentially automatic, the same calculation that led broadcasters across the country to pull anything involving planes, towers, explosions, or terrorism from their schedules in the weeks and months following the attacks. The scene was removed from the episode as it appeared in syndication and on Cartoon Network, and when the show's first volume of DVDs was released in the United States, the cut version was used there too. The original scene was gone from most places where an American viewer would encounter the episode. It was not gone entirely. The United Kingdom and Germany received DVD releases that retained the original cut, partly because the episode's specific sensitivity was understood differently in markets that had not experienced the attacks in the same direct way. In the United States, a later DVD collection called the Freakin' Sweet Collection, a compilation released in 2004, included the original version of the episode with the bin Laden scene intact. That release was somewhat limited and did not get the wide distribution of the regular season sets, but it meant the uncut version was available domestically if someone knew to look for it. Eventually, Hulu restored the original cut to its streaming version, making it accessible again to anyone who went looking for it on that platform. Netflix kept the cut version for its American library. iTunes carried the original. The situation became a minor point of confusion for fans trying to track down specific versions. McFarlane's own position on the cut was notably balanced when he addressed it publicly. In a 2003 interview, he laid out both sides of the argument without coming down firmly on either. The case for restoring the scene, in his telling, was that the episode had aired that way originally, that it predated the attacks by well over a year, and that there was some historical value in preserving the episode as it actually existed. The case for keeping it cut was that the attacks had been a genuine catastrophe, that some content becomes impossible to separate from the real events it accidentally mirrors, and that showing it without that context could feel gratuitously painful to people who had lost someone. He chose not to advocate loudly for either position, presenting both as legitimate and leaving the decision to the network and the distribution channels. The irony of the scene existing at all, given what McFarlane personally experienced on September September 11th is something that almost defies commentary. A man who came within 10 minutes of dying on one of the hijacked planes had, 16 months earlier, produced a 30-second joke in which the hijacker's leader waltzes through airport security by performing a musical number. The joke was written before the attacks and had nothing to do with them. But sitting with those two facts simultaneously, the scene and what McFarlane survived, makes the whole thing feel stranger than any deliberate piece of dark comedy could. For the show itself, the episode's legacy was shaped much more by what the cut did to it than by what the scene itself contained. Road to Rhode Island was already regarded as an exceptional episode before any of the airport controversy arose. The emotional arc of Brian's storyline, in which he tracks down the facility where his mother was used as a breeding dog and confronts feelings of abandonment he had been avoiding, gave the episode a weight that most Family Guy installments did not attempt. The final scene, in which Brian and Stewie drive through the night while a song plays over the quiet road, became one of the most talked about moments in the show's first 3 seasons. The kind of scene that people mentioned when arguing that Family Guy was capable of more than its detractors gave it credit for. The Bin Laden joke in the original broadcast was a throwaway beat in an episode that contained genuine emotional depth. Cutting it did not break the episode. The airport sequence still exists, still works, still gets Stewie and Brian onto their cross-country trip. The missing 30 seconds do not create a visible hole in the narrative. What they leave behind is a slightly different episode from the one that originally aired, and an awareness, for anyone who knows the history, of what used to be there. Among the strangest footnotes to the whole story is the conspiracy theory community that grew up around McFarlane's September 11th near miss. The fact that he had produced a scene involving Bin Laden and airport security, and had then barely survived missing a flight that Bin Laden's organization destroyed, was treated by some corners of the internet as evidence of something deliberate. The theories ranged from vague accusations of foreknowledge to elaborate claims about McFarlane's involvement in planning the attacks. None of them were remotely credible, but they circulated widely enough that McFarlane became aware of them and had to address the basic facts of what had actually happened, which were already well documented and entirely mundane. He overslept after a night out, his travel agent made a mistake, and he missed a flight. The sequence of events that saved his life was banal, and the Bin Laden airport scene was a throwaway joke written a year and a half before anyone had reason to think about airport security in that particular way. Years after the attacks, after Bin Laden had been killed in 2011, the question of whether the scene should be restored permanently to all versions of the episode became slightly less fraught. Some streaming platforms did restore it, others kept the cut. The Hulu version, with the original intact, became the most accessible way to see the episode as it originally aired, and the existence of that option meant that anyone sufficiently curious could find it without much difficulty. The scene was no longer the live wire it had been in 2001 or 2002. Bin Laden himself was gone. The raw grief that had made the joke genuinely unwatchable for many people had not disappeared, but it had changed shape over 2 decades in ways that made a 30-second airport gag feel less like an open wound and more like a piece of television history that happened to be very uncomfortable. Road to Rhode Island remained what it had always been, one of the show's finest episodes, built around a genuinely moving piece of storytelling about grief and abandonment, wrapped in the kind of absurdist comedy that the show did better than almost anyone. The Bin Laden scene was never the point of it. It was 30 seconds in an episode that ran for 22 minutes, and the episode worked perfectly well around it. The scene's notoriety came entirely from outside the episode, from the world that the episode had no way of anticipating when it was being written in 1999 and aired in the spring of 2000. That gap between what the show intended and what the world eventually made of it is the actual story. The scene did not cause anything. The scene did not predict anything. The scene just existed at the wrong historical moment, and the wrong historical moment turned out to be catastrophic enough to make even a throwaway airport joke feel impossible for a long time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next controversy the show ran into was longer, louder, and came from an organized group that had been waiting for a reason to go after Family Guy since the night it first aired. Section 4. The group that declared war on Family Guy. At least 40 times since Family Guy first aired in 1999, a conservative watchdog organization called the Parents Television Council declared it the worst show on television for that particular week. 40 is the confirmed minimum. The actual number is likely higher. No other show in the history of the organization's operation attracted that designation more frequently, and no other show inspired the volume of formal complaints, press releases, letter-writing campaigns, and federal filings that Family Guy generated across the first decade and a half of its run. The conflict between the PTC and Family Guy became one of the defining battles of the broadcast indecency debate in early 2000s America, and it produced one of the most direct pieces of self-referential television the show ever made. The Parents Television Council was founded in 1995 by conservative activist L. Brent Bozell III. Its stated mission was to protect children from harmful content on broadcast television, and its primary tool was organized pressure, mobilizing its membership to file complaints with the Federal Communications Commission, pressuring advertisers to withdraw from shows it considered indecent and generating enough media coverage of its campaigns to make networks nervous about the content they were putting on air. The organization claimed a membership of over 1 million people at various points during the 2000s, and its ability to generate large volumes of FCC complaints quickly made it a force that broadcasters could not ignore entirely, even when they disagreed with its positions. Family Guy was on the PTC's radar from almost the beginning. The show's combination of sexual humor, violence played for laughs, religious satire, and content involving children, specifically Stewie's elaborate plots and the show's general willingness to put disturbing material in the mouths of infant and child characters, was precisely the kind of programming the organization existed to oppose. Within the first couple of seasons, the PTC had already singled out multiple Family Guy episodes for criticism, and the pattern of weekly worst show designations had begun. Seth MacFarlane was aware of the organization early and made no secret of his contempt for it, describing its positions as attempts to impose a narrow set of cultural values on the entire viewing public through regulatory pressure rather than through actual persuasion. The legal context the PTC was operating in changed dramatically in February 2004 when singer Janet Jackson's breast was briefly exposed during the Super Bowl XXXAI halftime show. The incident, which lasted a fraction of a second during a live broadcast watched by roughly 90 million people, triggered an unprecedented wave of FCC complaints, most of them generated by organized campaigns from groups including the PTC. CBS was fined hundreds of thousands of dollars per affiliate station, a penalty that was later overturned on procedural grounds after years of legal appeals, but the regulatory environment in the immediate aftermath of the incident shifted sharply towards stricter enforcement. Congress increased the maximum fine per indecency violation from $27,000 to $325,000 per broadcast. Networks that had been relatively comfortable absorbing the occasional FCC fine suddenly faced potential penalties large enough to change business decisions. Family Guy came back from cancellation in May 2005, walking directly into that altered regulatory landscape. The PTC escalated its campaign almost immediately. Within the same year, it launched a coordinated effort encouraging its membership to file FCC indecency complaints about a specific episode, targeting the content for formal regulatory action rather than just public criticism. The episode in question was called PTV, and the choice of target was significant, because PTV was not an ordinary Family Guy episode that happened to offend the PTC. It was an episode written specifically about the PTC's campaign against Family Guy, and it aired while that campaign was actively ongoing. The episode's plot is built directly around the Janet Jackson incident, a wardrobe malfunction at an awards show, involving a fictional network character rather than a real performer, prompts the FCC to begin censoring television with increasing aggression, blurring and bleeping content that the organization considers indecent. Peter responds by starting his own television network, which he calls PTV, broadcasting uncensored versions of classic shows and original programming that the FCC cannot touch. The name PTV is a direct one-letter alteration of PTC, and nobody involved in writing the episode pretended otherwise. The show was mocking the organization explicitly and by name, disguised only barely enough to avoid a lawsuit. MacFarlane later said the episode came directly out of frustration, describing his feeling about the post-Jackson broadcast climate as genuine rage over the regulatory overreach that had followed a half-second of exposed skin on a live broadcast. The PTC's response was to consider filing an FCC complaint about the very episode that was satirizing the FCC complaint process. The organization's president at the time, Tim Winter, publicly discussed the possibility of filing a formal indecency complaint about PTV, which would have meant using the regulatory mechanism the episode was mocking to penalize the mockery. The PTC ultimately pulled back from filing that specific complaint, possibly recognizing that the optics of the move were exactly what the Family Guy writers would have scripted if given the choice. The episode went on to be featured in a Fox special highlighting the network's most popular moments, which was its own kind of answer to the controversy. The broader FCC complaint campaign the PTC ran against Family Guy was more sustained and more consequential than any single episode dispute. Over the years, the organization filed formal indecency complaints with the FCC covering multiple specific episodes, citing content involving sexual humor, violent imagery, drug references, and jokes about subjects including child molestation, rape, and bodily functions. The complaints were detailed, quoting specific dialogue and describing specific scenes, and they were accompanied by organized letter-writing drives that generated large volumes of supporting complaints from PTC members. The FCC's response to most of these complaints was to deny them. The Commission repeatedly reviewed the cited content and found that it did not meet the legal standard for actionable broadcast indecency, which requires material to be patently offensive as measured by contemporary community standards, and to depict or describe sexual or excretory activities in an explicit or graphic manner. Family Guy's humor, even at its most aggressive, was generally found to fall short of that standard on the grounds that it used suggestion, implication, and absurdist framing rather than explicit depiction. The FCC denied the complaints against several specific episodes, including one that had been filed over an episode containing repeated references to a part of the male anatomy, finding that the jokes, while juvenile, did not rise to the level of broadcast indecency under the Commission's guidelines. The most dramatic single moment in the PTC's campaign against Family Guy came in 2009, following the broadcast of an episode called Family Gay. The episode's plot involved Peter temporarily identifying as gay after being exposed to a hormone treatment administered to farm animals, and it contained a sequence of cutaway gags depicting sexual content involving multiple characters. The PTC mobilized its membership to file FCC complaints, and the response was larger than anything the show had generated before. More than 188,000 individual complaints were filed with the FCC about that single episode, the largest volume of complaints the show had ever attracted, and one of the largest in the FCC's history for any broadcast content. Fox, in its response to the FCC, did something unusual. The network filed documents with the Commission, arguing that some of the complaints themselves were fraudulent, claiming to have identified at least 16 complaints that appeared to be fabricated rather than genuine expressions of viewer offense. Fox's position was that the PTC's organized complaint generation process, which provided members with pre-written form letters and encouraged mass submission, undermined the reliability of the complaint system as a measure of actual public sentiment. The network argued that the FCC should not treat a coordinated form letter campaign as equivalent to organic individual complaints, and that the Commission's enforcement process was being manipulated by an organization whose goal was regulatory rather than expressive. The PTC pushed back, arguing that its members were real people expressing genuine offense, and that the fact that their complaints were coordinated did not make them less legitimate. The dispute revealed a fundamental tension in how broadcast indecency regulation worked. The FCC's complaint-based system assumed that complaints were organic signals of public sentiment, but any sufficiently organized group could flood the system with complaints about content it opposed on ideological grounds, regardless of what the broader public actually thought about the material. The FCC denied the complaints about Family Gay, as it had denied most of the others, but the 188,000 complaint wave had made the regulatory and political pressure on Fox very real, regardless of the outcome. Throughout the entire period of the PTC campaign, Family Guy responded in kind. The show referenced the organization repeatedly, sometimes by the thinly veiled initials, sometimes through clearly drawn fictional analogs. An episode called The 2,000-Year-Old Virgin included a scene where Peter directs people to complain to a group he calls the Family Television Council, a reference so transparent it required no decoding. The show treated the PTC as both a legitimate threat worth taking seriously and a comic target worth mocking, which was consistent with how McFarlane approached most things that annoyed him. The response was rarely defensive. It was almost always aggressive, which suited a show that had been canceled twice and had come back with the confidence of something that had already survived being killed. What the PTC campaign actually accomplished is harder to assess than the volume of complaints and press releases might suggest. The FCC complaints largely failed in their regulatory goals. The fines that were threatened rarely materialized, and the ones that did were overturned on appeal. Advertisers did occasionally respond to PTC pressure by pulling spots from Family Guy, but the show's ratings were strong enough that replacement advertisers were not difficult to find. The organizational infrastructure Fox had built around the show, combined with the show's consistent performance in the demographic that advertisers most wanted to reach, gave the network enough commercial insulation to withstand the pressure campaigns. Where the PTC did have real influence was in the broader regulatory climate that it helped create and sustain. The post-Jackson FCC environment, which the PTC had done as much as any single organization to shape, genuinely constrained what broadcast networks were willing to put on the air during the years between 2004 and the gradual relaxation of enforcement that followed. Family Guy itself, despite being a frequent target, operated under the implicit awareness that the regulatory environment had teeth, even if those teeth had not yet bitten the show directly. McFarlane and the writers pushed hard against those constraints, but they were aware of them, and the show's calculated aggression was always in part a response to the pressure of operating under a system that could theoretically fine Fox hundreds of thousands of dollars per affiliate station for a single offensive moment. The PTV episode captured that dynamic better than any press release or legal filing could. The FCC, as depicted in that episode, starts with a single complaint about a single moment of accidental nudity and ends up censoring everyday life, sending agents into the Griffin home to bleep profanity spoken in private conversations and block out bodies in ways that make normal existence impossible. The satire was exaggerated, but its target was real. The logic of broadcast indecency regulation, taken to its endpoint, requires someone to decide what words and images are too dangerous for adults to encounter without prior governmental approval, and the organization most actively pushing that logic in 2005 was the one whose initials the episode had borrowed for its fictional television network. McFarlane's position, consistent across the entire period of the PTC's campaign, was that broadcast standards were being driven by a small, organized minority rather rather than by any genuine measure of public sentiment. His argument was not that anything should be permitted on television at any hour, but that the mechanism through which content was regulated was being exploited by groups whose goal was ideological rather than protective. A million form letters about a single episode, he suggested in various interviews, did not mean that a million people were genuinely harmed by the content. It meant that a million people had been asked by an organization they belonged to for other reasons to file a complaint about something that organization opposed. The conflict eventually settled into something like a cold equilibrium. The PTC continued to designate Family Guy as the worst show on television, with enough regularity to make the designation feel almost like a regular feature of the show's promotional materials. MacFarlane continued to mock the organization when the opportunity arose. Fox continued to air the show. The FCC continued to decline most of the formal complaints. No single regulatory action ever succeeded in substantially altering the show's content, and by the time the broader broadcast indecency enforcement environment had relaxed somewhat in the years after 2008, the practical stakes of the conflict had diminished enough that the war had become more symbolic than operational. What the PTC campaign left behind was a detailed public record of exactly what the show's critics found most objectionable, and exactly what the regulatory system was prepared to do about it, which turned out to be considerably less than the most aggressive complaints had demanded. Family Guy emerged from the fight with its content largely intact and its creator significantly more combative than he had been when the campaign started. The show that came out the other side of 10 years of organized pressure was not a chastened version of itself. The experience of being targeted that consistently and surviving it that consistently seemed to confirm for the people making the show that the content was worth defending. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next scandal the show walked into had nothing to do with regulatory pressure or organized campaigns. It came from a real-world tragedy that happened to echo a joke the show had made a month earlier, and the response was faster and more complete than anything the PTC had ever managed to force. Section 5. The joke that aired 1 month too early. On March 17, 2013, Family Guy aired an episode called Turban Cowboy. The episode followed Peter Griffin befriending a Muslim man named Mahmoud after a hospital stay in Las Vegas, gradually getting drawn into the world of Islamic culture, and eventually discovering that Mahmoud and his associates were planning to blow up a bridge in Quahog. Along the way, the episode contained a cutaway gag showing Peter driving his car through the Boston Marathon, plowing through runners at the finish line, bodies scattering across the road as he pushed toward the tape. Peter wins the race. The crowd cheers. The joke was dark even by Family Guy standards, treating mass casualties as a punchline, and it generated some criticism when it aired. But the episode moved through its broadcast window and settled into the usual post-air routine of mild complaint and rapid forgetting. 31 days later, on April 15, 2013, 2 pressure cooker bombs detonated near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. 3 people were killed, and more than 260 were injured. The attackers were brothers, named Joker and Tamerlan Tsarnaev, both of Chechen origin, both radicalized into jihadist extremism. The bombing was the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil since September 11, 2001. Within 48 hours of the bombing, someone had already found Turban Cowboy and started editing it. 2 separate scenes from the episode were spliced together into a single clip and uploaded to YouTube. The first scene showed Bob Costas interviewing Peter at the marathon finish line, asking how he had won the race. The second scene, from a completely different part of the episode, showed Peter accidentally detonating explosions by dialing a terrorist's cell phone. The edit placed those 2 scenes back to back, removing the 20 minutes of episode that separated them, creating a clip that made it look as though Peter had blown up the Boston Marathon with a phone call. The sequence in the actual episode involved a bridge, not a marathon. The phone and the marathon existed in entirely separate narrative contexts. The edited clip combined them into something the episode had never contained. The clip spread rapidly. People sharing it were not all operating in bad faith. Many viewers had not seen the episode and had no way of knowing the clip was a fabrication. The visual logic of the edit was simple enough to be convincing on a quick viewing, especially for anyone who was already primed by 48 hours of wall-to-wall news coverage about a bombing at a marathon. The clip looked like what people were afraid it was, a piece of entertainment media that had somehow anticipated or glorified the attack, and that appearance was enough to push it across social media at speed. MacFarlane responded on Twitter within hours of the clip gaining traction. His message was direct and unambiguous. The edited clip was abhorrent, he wrote. The attack was a crime and a tragedy, and his thoughts were with the victims. He did not hedge or qualify. Several other Family Guy writers and cast members retweeted and echoed the statement. The production's position was clear. The clip was a fabrication. The episode had not depicted what people were claiming it depicted, and the people responsible for the edit had done something genuinely harmful by making a fake piece of media about a real mass casualty event and spreading it while the victims were still being treated. Fox moved quickly in the institutional direction. The network confirmed that it had pulled Turban Cowboy from Fox.com and from Hulu, where it had been available for streaming. The episode was also removed from Amazon's streaming library. Fox stated that it had no immediate plans to rebroadcast the episode. YouTube began flagging and removing the edited clip and discussions around it, though the internet's basic tendency to preserve and redistribute content meant that copies of the clip continued circulating in various corners of the platform for months afterward. The speed of Fox's response was notable. The network had not moved that quickly in response to any of the PTC's years of complaints and FCC filings. Those had been institutional and procedural, playing out over months and years through regulatory channels. The Boston Marathon bombing produced a different kind of pressure, immediate, grief-charged, and publicly visible, and Fox's response reflected that. Within days of the bombing, the episode had been scrubbed from every streaming platform the network controlled. What followed was a period of sustained absence. The episode did not return to Fox's own streaming ecosystem for years. It remained available on physical media, and the full unedited episode existed in enough places online that determined viewers could find it, but its removal from the major platforms was effectively total. The cutaway gag showing Peter driving through the marathon runners had existed before the bombing, had aired on national television, and had generated a certain amount of negative attention on its own. After the bombing, that gag became impossible to discuss without the context of what had happened in Boston, regardless of the fact that the show had made it 5 weeks before anyone was harmed. The specific circumstances of the viral clip added a layer of complexity to the controversy that purely coincidental dark humor would not have had. The Turban Cowboy situation was not simply a case of a joke aging badly because of a real-world event. It was a case where a deliberately falsified version of the episode had been created and circulated with enough skill that large numbers of people believed the show had depicted something it had not actually depicted. The reputational damage to Family Guy in the immediate aftermath of the bombing came primarily from the fake clip rather than from the episode itself. People who had seen the actual episode understood the difference. People who had only seen the edited clip, which was most of the people discussing it in the days immediately following the bombing, were responding to content that did not exist. That distinction did not ultimately change Fox's decision. The network was not making a fine editorial judgment about the specific content of the episode versus the fabricated clip. It was making a practical judgment about the risk of leaving any version of this material accessible during an active national grief event. An episode that showed Peter winning the Boston Marathon by driving through runners, regardless of any surrounding context, was not something Fox was prepared to defend in the week after a real bombing at the Boston Marathon had killed people. The calculus was straightforward. The episode came down. The decision drew some criticism from people who felt the removal rewarded the fabricators of the fake clip, effectively punishing Family Guy for something it had not done by treating the show as though it had done the thing the clip depicted. That argument has some logic. Pulling the episode because of a fraudulent edit arguably gave the edit more power over the show's distribution than the actual content of the episode warranted. But the counter-argument is equally clear. Whatever the chain of events that led to the episode being pulled, leaving a piece of entertainment media featuring a cartoon character winning the Boston Marathon by driving over runners accessible on major streaming platforms in the week of the actual Boston Marathon bombing, was not a defensible position for a broadcaster to hold. The episode's actual content, separate from the fabricated clip, had its own problems that were worth sitting with. The main plot of Turban Cowboy followed Peter befriending a Muslim man and getting drawn into a terrorist plot. The episode's Muslim characters were written as a mix of genuinely friendly individuals and, eventually, active terrorists, with the pivotal joke being that the nice man Peter had made friends with in a hospital was involved in planning a bombing. Critics of the episode argued that this structure reinforced a pattern of associating Islam with terrorism that the show had trafficked in before, and that the joke did not land as clearly satirical in the way that the show's defenders claimed. The execution, in their view, relied on the audience laughing at the revelation that the Muslim character was a terrorist, rather than laughing at any clearly identified target of satire. McFarlane had long maintained that the show's offensive content was satirical rather than sincere, that the jokes about ethnic and religious groups worked because the audience understood that the show was exposing prejudice rather than endorsing it. The problem with that defense, applied specifically to Turban Cowboy, was that the episode's structure made the satirical target unclear. Peter's ignorance is usually the subject of the show's jokes about race and religion. In Turban Cowboy, Peter's ignorance leads him to befriend a man who turns out to actually be a terrorist, which does not obviously satirize prejudice so much as accidentally confirm it. The joke worked differently from episodes where Peter's wrong assumptions were clearly corrected by reality. Here, his assumed connection between a Muslim acquaintance and terrorism turned out to be accurate, which is a different comedic structure with different implications. None of that nuanced critical discussion was what dominated the public conversation in April 2013. What dominated was the fake clip, the bombing, and the removal of the episode. The deeper questions about what the episode was actually doing were crowded out by the speed and scale of the immediate crisis, and by the time enough distance had accumulated for calmer analysis, most people had moved on to other things. For years, Turban Cowboy was effectively invisible on mainstream streaming platforms. Then, in September 2013, 2022, Hulu quietly restored the episode to its Family Guy library. No announcement accompanied the restoration. The episode simply reappeared, 9 years after it had been pulled, with no explanation from Fox or Hulu about what had changed or why that particular moment had been chosen for the return. Viewers who noticed flagged it online, and the restoration generated a brief wave of coverage, mostly noting the fact of its return rather than relitigating the original controversy. By 2022, the episode's return felt less like a vindication than like a quiet administrative decision. The Boston Marathon bombing had receded enough in the cultural timeline that an animated comedy making dark jokes about marathon runners was no longer the live issue it had been. The Tsarnaev brothers had been convicted and sentenced. The city of Boston had held years of subsequent marathons. The specific raw grief of April 2013 had transformed into something older and more settled. Hulu restoring the episode was not a statement about the episode's quality or the appropriateness of its content. It was simply the streaming service deciding that the circumstances that had made the episode radioactive 9 years earlier no longer applied in the same way. The marathon cutaway gag, the thing that had made the episode impossible to defend in April 2013, was still in the restored version. Nothing had been edited or removed. Peter still drives through the runners. The joke still exists in the same form it always had, which meant that anyone watching in 2022 was watching the same content that had been pulled in 2013. The decision to pull it had been contextual rather than editorial. The decision to restore it was contextual too. The episode had not changed. The context had. What the entire episode reveals about how broadcast media handles real-world tragedy is something worth understanding. The standard practice, observed consistently across American television history, is to pull content that echoes a real tragedy regardless of whether the content caused or predicted anything. The logic is protective rather than analytical. A comedy that happened to depict something resembling a real mass casualty event will be pulled from circulation in the period immediately following that event. Not because the comedy is responsible for anything, but because airing it during active public grief is understood as a specific kind of harm, the harm of making light of something people are still living through. Family Guy had already navigated one version of this dynamic with the Bin Laden scene in Road to Rhode Island, cut after September 11, despite having been made a year and a half before the attacks. Turban Cowboy followed the same pattern at much higher speed, and with the additional complication of the fabricated clip. The show had made a dark joke about a real event before the event happened, and the event then made the joke unwatchable. That sequence is not something a writing room can reliably protect against, because it requires predicting which dark jokes will eventually be too close to real tragedies, and the whole point of dark comedy is that nobody can know in advance which darkness will become real. MacFarlane never offered a formal apology for the episode's content. He condemned the fabricated clip clearly and publicly. He expressed sympathy for the bombing's victims. He did not say the show had done anything wrong by making the jokes it had made 5 weeks before anyone was harmed. His position, consistent with how he had handled every previous controversy the show had generated, was that the episode was what it was. The fabricated clip was something else entirely, and the two should not be treated as the same thing. Whether that distinction fully satisfied the people who found the episode's content objectionable regardless of the bombing was a different question, and not one that was ever going to be settled cleanly. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A joke made 5 weeks before a real tragedy pulled the episode from every platform overnight. The next scandal was different. Fox banned an episode before it ever aired, and it has never been shown on American television since. Section 6. The episode that has never aired in America. Fox's decision to pull Turban Cowboy happened within 48 hours of a national tragedy, driven by grief and public pressure and the speed of a viral crisis. The decision to suppress partial terms of endearment was different in almost every way. It was made slowly, deliberately, and before anyone outside the production had seen the episode. There was no tragedy, no fake clip, no organized campaign. Fox simply looked at what its own writers had made, considered the subject matter, and decided that no version of American television was ready for it. The episode has never aired in the United States. Not on Fox, not on Adult Swim, not in syndication, not on any cable channel that carries the show's reruns. It is the only Family Guy episode that can make that claim, and the circumstances around the decision reveal something specific about where the real limits of broadcast television actually sit. The episode was produced as part of the 8th season, written by Danny Smith and directed by Joseph Lee. Its title, Partial Terms of Endearment, signals its subject in the same way the show usually signals things, through a pun that tells you exactly what territory the episode is walking into before a single scene has played. The premise places Lois at the center of the story, which was itself unusual for a show that typically used her as a counterweight to Peter's chaos, rather than as the primary driver of a plot. At her 20th college reunion, Lois reconnects with an old friend named Naomi, who along with her husband is unable to conceive a child. Naomi asks Lois to serve as a surrogate mother. Lois agrees. She undergoes the procedure, becomes pregnant, and is carrying the fetus when Naomi and her husband are killed in a car accident. What follows is an episode built entirely around the question of what Lois should do with the pregnancy, and specifically around whether she will choose to have an abortion. That word, abortion, was the reason Fox refused to air it, not the handling of the subject, not the specific jokes, not a particular scene or line of dialogue. The subject itself, the fact that the episode centered on a character choosing whether to terminate a pregnancy and ultimately choosing to do so, was enough for Fox to make the decision before the episode had even finished production. Kevin Reilly, who was Fox's president of entertainment at the time, explained the decision in terms that were notable for their candor. He said the subject was the most sensitive of all hot-button issues, that the economic climate made controversy especially costly, and that the episode felt like it could cause trouble in a way that was simply not worth the risk to the network. He also acknowledged, without apparent irony, that the episode handled the subject well. The problem was not execution. The problem was existence. That acknowledgement from a network president is worth sitting with. The standard defense for pulling content is usually that the content itself is problematic, that it crosses a line, that it handles a sensitive subject badly enough to warrant suppression. Reilly's stated position was the opposite. The episode was competently made. The subject was just too dangerous to touch, regardless of how competently it was made. Fox was not saying the writers had failed. Fox was saying there was no version of this story it was prepared to broadcast, good or bad, because the story itself was the problem. Peter's arc through the episode illustrates why Fox might have found the subject genuinely difficult to defend. He initially supports Lois having an abortion, reasoning practically that the biological parents are gone and that carrying the pregnancy to term creates obligations nobody agreed to in the original arrangement. He then encounters an anti-abortion activist outside the clinic who shows him a propaganda video, and he swings immediately to the opposite position, becoming loudly and aggressively anti-abortion with the kind of sudden conviction that characterizes every position Peter has ever held for more than 20 minutes. He pressures Lois, makes a series of arguments rooted in the anti-abortion rhetoric from the video, and creates conflict in the household in the way he creates conflict in every episode, which is to say clumsily and with total commitment to whichever wrong idea he has most recently acquired. Lois, by contrast, moves through the episode with more genuine deliberation than she usually gets to show. She considers the situation, pushes back on Peter, and eventually makes a decision that the episode presents as her own, arrived at through reflection rather than ideology. The episode ends with the confirmation that she has had the abortion. Peter, in the final scene, has already moved on to being wrong about something else entirely. The show does not treat the decision as a tragedy or a triumph. It treats it as a decision Lois made, which she had the right to make, and which the show declines to moralize around in either direction. That structural neutrality was itself a choice with political implications. An episode that showed a character choosing abortion and then simply moving on, without punishment or redemption or visible consequence, was implicitly taking a position on whether abortion was a decision a person could make without being defined by it. The episode did not argue for abortion. It depicted a character having won and continuing to exist normally afterward, which in the context of American television in 2010 was sufficiently uncommon to constitute a statement in itself. Fox made its decision before the season aired, and the announcement was public enough that the Family Guy production team knew before transmission that the episode would not be going out. The slot it would have occupied in the broadcast schedule was filled instead by a clip show, a collection of musical numbers from previous episodes presented under the title Family Guy Live in Quahog. The replacement content was as far from the banned episode's subject matter as it was possible to get, while still technically broadcasting a Family Guy product. Adult Swim, which had aired the previously suppressed When You Wish Upon a Weinstein years earlier and had been a reliable secondary home for Family Guy content, did not pick this one up. Fox had specifically asked the network not to air it, and Adult Swim complied. The episode was therefore not just absent from Fox's broadcast, it was absent from the entire American television ecosystem in a way that no previous Family Guy episode had been. No American channel showed it. No American streaming service carried it. The only domestic way to see it was a standalone DVD release that arrived in September 2010, available for purchase but not through any subscription or broadcast channel. Outside the United States, the situation was different. BBC Three aired the episode in the United Kingdom on June 20th, 2010, making it the episode's first broadcast anywhere in the world. Australian television also carried it. Both international broadcasts involved some editing for time and content standards, but the core of the episode, including its ending, was present in both versions. The United Kingdom transmission happened nearly 3 months before the American DVD release, meaning that the episode's world premiere was on British television rather than anywhere in its country of origin. The reviews that accompanied the DVD release were, in their own way, another version of the anticlimactic response that had greeted When You Wish Upon a Weinstein years earlier. Critics who sat down with the episode found a Family Guy installment that was competently constructed, funnier than its reputation suggested, and nowhere near as incendiary as its banned status implied. An IGN reviewer gave it a 7 out of 10, noting the episode's thematic boldness while observing that the humor operated within the show's usual framework and that the controversy surrounding the ban somewhat overstated the episode's actual provocation. expectations. A DVD Talk critic found it unremarkable by Family Guy standards, suggesting that the ban had created expectations the episode could not meet. That gap between reputation and content had become a recurring feature of Family Guy's suppressed episodes. The show's most controversial material was often not what ended up being pulled. The things that got pulled were usually pulled for reasons that had less to do with the content's actual impact and more to do with a broadcaster's anxiety about the subject, the timing, or the optics of defending it. Partial terms of endearment is the clearest example of that pattern. The episode that has never aired on American television is not the show's darkest episode, its most offensive episode, or even its most explicit engagement with a sensitive subject. It is the episode whose subject triggered a specific kind of institutional fear that no amount of skilled execution could overcome. The episode's unavailability in the American streaming ecosystem has remained consistent for years. Hulu, which eventually restored Turban Cowboy after 9 years, has never carried partial terms of endearment. Disney Plus, which added Family Guy to its library, does not have it. The complete series collections available on various platforms skip past it. In the syndication packages that air the show in local markets, the episode slot is occupied by the clip show that replaced it in 2010. The ban has not softened with time, in the way that the Turban Cowboy ban eventually softened. Fox has never publicly revisited the decision or suggested that circumstances have changed enough to warrant a reconsideration. The political landscape around abortion in America has, of course, changed substantially since 2010, and not in a direction that would make an episode about a character choosing abortion easier to broadcast. The Supreme Court's 2022 decision overturning Roe v. Wade made the subject more politically charged than it had been when Riley described it as a hot-button issue too sensitive to touch. If the episode's subject made Fox nervous in 2010, the current environment would not obviously make a reconsideration more appealing. The episode remains what it has always been, a piece of television that exists on DVD and in the memories of the people who saw it internationally, but that American broadcast and streaming audiences have never been given the chance to encounter through normal viewing channels. What makes the ban genuinely significant, beyond the specifics of its content, is what it reveals about the distinction between what broadcast television will satirize and what it will merely touch. Family Guy had spent 11 years at the time of partial terms of endearment making jokes about subjects including cancer, AIDS, rape, child abuse, terrorism, racial violence, and religious extremism. The show had depicted characters doing things that were, in any realistic moral accounting, far worse than having an abortion. Peter Griffin had committed acts of violence that would constitute serious felonies if performed by a real person. Quagmire's entire characterization rested on behavior that the show acknowledged, in its own way, as predatory. Stewie had built weapons of mass destruction and plotted the deaths of multiple characters across hundreds of episodes. None of that had ever gotten a Family Guy episode banned from American television. A character choosing abortion, and the show declining to punish her for it, did. That contrast says something about the specific nature of the line Fox was drawing, which was not a line about darkness or offense or the capacity of content to disturb audiences. It was a line about which political controversies a broadcaster was prepared to step into, and abortion sat on one side of that line in a way that mass cartoon violence, sexual predation played for laughs, and infant characters wielding firearms simply did not. The episode's writer, Danny Smith, has spoken about the ban with a combination of pride and frustration that captures the paradox the situation creates for anyone involved in making it. The episode exists. It is available for anyone willing to seek it out. The people who have seen it generally find it a solid piece of television that handles a genuinely difficult subject with more care than the show is usually credited with. The ban did not erase it. What the ban did was ensure that the audience for it remained self-selecting, composed only of people who already knew enough about it to look for it. The casual viewer who watches Family Guy through normal channels, through streaming, through syndication reruns on a Tuesday afternoon, has never had the episode placed in front of them the way every other episode eventually is. The standalone DVD copy, available on Amazon in a Family Guy Specials package, continues to be the primary domestic access point for American viewers. Physical media is an increasingly marginal format, and the people most likely to purchase a standalone DVD of a specific Family Guy episode are the people who already know enough about it to want it. The episode finds its audience through motivated seeking rather than casual discovery, which is a different relationship between a piece of television and the people who watch it than any other episode in the show's history has. McFarlane's position on the ban has been consistent without being combative. He has not mounted a sustained public campaign for the episode's release. He has noted that the subject matter was handled well and that the network made a business decision he understood, even if he did not agree with it. That measured response is in keeping with how he has generally approached the show's most difficult controversies, acknowledging the reality of the decision without surrendering to the logic behind it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The only episode that has never aired in America was banned over a single word. The next controversy involved a character who could not be reduced to a single word, and the backlash came from a community the show had claimed to be defending. Section 7. The The episode that got the transgender debate wrong. Quagmire had been one of Family Guy's most consistently problematic characters since the show's first season, a fact the show acknowledged openly and used as a running joke. His predatory behavior toward women was a defining character trait, played for laughs across hundreds of episodes, and the show had never seriously reckoned with what that characterization meant. Then, in the 18th episode of the 8th season, Family Guy gave Quagmire a storyline that required genuine emotional weight, and the show discovered that years of using a character purely as a vehicle for shock comedy had not prepared it to handle that character in a context requiring sensitivity. The episode was called Quagmire's Dad, and it aired on May 9, 2010. The backlash it generated came not from the Parents Television Council or from a politician looking for a cultural target, but from the LGBTQ advocacy community, which had watched the episode and concluded that whatever the show intended, what it had actually produced was something harmful. The premise placed Quagmire at the center of a story about his father, Dan, a decorated Navy veteran who arrives in Quahog and reveals that he has always been a woman living in the wrong body and intends to undergo gender confirmation surgery. The episode introduced Dan's post-operative identity as Ida Davis, a trans woman voiced by Seth MacFarlane using a female register. Quagmire's emotional arc was built around his difficulty accepting his parents' transition, the tension between the father he had known and the woman his parent now was. The show framed Quagmire's struggle as something the episode wanted the audience to understand, if not entirely endorse, while positioning his eventual acceptance of Ida as the emotional destination the story was moving toward. MacFarlane had spoken publicly about the episode before it aired, describing it in an interview with an LGBTQ media outlet as a sympathetic portrayal of a transgender character. His intent, as he expressed it, was to use Quagmire's specific situation to humanize transgender experience for an audience that might not otherwise encounter it. Ida was portrayed as a Vietnam War hero, someone who had served the country, lived with her identity suppressed for decades, and finally reached a point where she could live honestly. Those biographical details were meant to establish her as a fully realized person whose transgender identity was one dimension of a complex life rather than a joke in itself. MacFarlane's stated position was that the episode handled its subject with more care and empathy than critics were giving it credit for. GLAAD's assessment was sharply different. The Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation reviewed the episode and described it as incredibly offensive to transgender people. Their criticism focused on the specific ways other characters responded to Ida throughout the episode, responses that the show presented without apparent awareness of how they would land with transgender viewers or with anyone paying attention to how trans people were actually being treated in American public life in 2010. Peter and Lois reacted to Ida's identity with confusion and mockery. Lois, normally the voice of reason in the Griffin household, made comments and took actions that the episode presented as comic without clearly identifying them as wrong. The food Ida had prepared for a dinner party was thrown away by Meg after Lois told her to, with no explanation given and no character holding Lois accountable for the behavior. The scene that drew the most sustained criticism came at the episode's end. Brian, who had been away at a seminar during the episode's main events, returns to discover that the woman he had slept with the previous night was Quagmire's post-operative father. His reaction was a prolonged vomiting sequence, 30 uninterrupted seconds of retching into a puddle on the floor, staged as a sustained comic set piece with a timer-like quality to the length of it. The scene was designed to be funny. The humor was built on Brian's physical disgust at the revelation, and the episode played the reaction straight as comedy without framing it as wrong or suggesting that Brian's response was something the show was critical of. That was where the episode's handling broke down most visibly, at least for critics paying close attention. The vomiting scene was not presented as Brian being transphobic in a way the show was calling out. It was presented as a natural reaction to an unpleasant surprise, played for laughs in the same register the show used for Peter driving into things or Quagmire getting hurt. The distinction between depicting a response and endorsing it matters in satire, and Family Guy had always relied on that distinction to defend its more offensive content. But the vomiting scene was difficult to read as critique. Nothing in the episode positioned Brian's reaction as the subject of the joke. The audience was invited to laugh at the scene, which meant they were being invited to find Brian's physical revulsion at the idea of having slept with a trans woman funny, and that invitation was not obviously satirical. Brian also compared Ida to a sex offender during the episode, on the grounds that when trans people move to a new place, they ought to notify the neighborhood. The line drew a direct connection between transgender identity and predatory criminality, one of the most damaging and persistent false associations used against trans people in political and social contexts. MacFarlane and the writing staff appeared to intend the line as a joke about Brian's ignorance, but the episode did not clearly mark Brian's ignorance as ignorance. Characters who say wrong things in satire are usually shown to be wrong in a way the audience can register. In this case, the line landed and moved on, without correction or consequence, which made it difficult to identify as the subject of critique rather than as the show simply making the association for a laugh. The Parents Television Council weighed in on the episode as well, though from a predictably different angle. The organization criticized the episode's handling of transgender themes themes on grounds related to its depiction of sexuality rather than its treatment of trans identity, citing the plot involving Brian sleeping with a trans woman as inappropriate content for the show's broadcast window. The PTC and GLAAD were coming at the same episode from opposite directions, one arguing the show had gone too far in its engagement with trans identity, the other arguing it had not gone nearly far enough in engaging with it responsibly. MacFarlane found himself in the position of having produced something that managed to offend two groups with fundamentally incompatible critiques simultaneously. MacFarlane's response to GLAAD's criticism in the months following the episode's broadcast reflected something between genuine defensiveness and genuine surprise. He expressed in a September 2010 interview that he did not meet many stupid gay people, a statement aimed at the idea that gay audiences should have been able to parse the satirical intent of the episode's comedy. The comment, intended to suggest that LGBTQ viewers were capable of understanding the show's satirical framework, came across instead as dismissive of the specific objections that had been raised, which were not about the audience's intelligence, but about the episode's actual structural choices. He also reiterated his belief that Ida was a sympathetic portrayal and defended Brian's vomiting as a realistic comic depiction of a specific kind of shock, rather than a statement about trans people as a category. The context the episode was produced in matters for understanding why the criticism landed as hard as it did. Quagmire's Dad aired in May 2010, which was not a period of cultural innocence around transgender representation. The same year, the Canadian drama Degrassi introduced Adam Torres as a transgender main character, the first of its kind in Canadian television history. American media had been developing more nuanced depictions of trans people for several years before the Family Guy episode aired. Dirty Sexy Money had cast Candace Caney, a trans actress, in a recurring role in primetime. Various documentaries and news programs had begun engaging with transgender experience in more substantive ways. The episode did not arrive in a vacuum where any transgender representation, however clumsy, could be credited as progressive simply for existing. The baseline had moved, and Quagmire's Dad was being measured against a standard that had quietly risen around it. One of the episode's structural problems was that it placed Quagmire in the position of being the character who needed to learn acceptance, while allowing every other major character to behave badly toward Ida with no accountability whatsoever. Peter made jokes, Lois acted with quiet hostility, Brian responded with physical revulsion. None of them were shown to be wrong by the episode's end. The show's moral weight was distributed entirely onto Quagmire's arc, making his eventual acceptance of Ida seem like the lesson the episode was trying to teach, while leaving the behavior of every other character unaddressed and unremarked upon. That structure created an episode that gestures toward a sympathetic message while surrounding that gesture with content that undermines it at every turn. Quagmire's own arc had its own complication. The episode treated his difficulty accepting Ida's transition as something to be understood rather than simply condemned, which was a legitimate creative choice. A character who has known their parent one way for their entire life and who is suddenly confronted with a fundamental revision of that understanding would plausibly struggle. The episode was correct to take that struggle seriously rather than resolving it instantly. What it did not do was take Ida's perspective with anything close to the same seriousness. Ida's inner life was largely absent from the episode. The audience learned almost nothing about her experience of having lived with her identity suppressed, her feelings about the transition, or her relationship with Quagmire's complicated response. The episode was about how Quagmire felt about having a trans parent, not about what it meant to be Ida. The final scene of Quagmire's arc ended with him accepting Ida and the episode choosing to mark that acceptance with a joke about an involuntary physical response, which managed to make the moment of acceptance simultaneously genuine and undercut. The episode wanted to end on a note of emotional resolution, but chose to frame that resolution through exactly the kind of crude physical comedy that had characterized its least defensible moments throughout. The result was an episode that seemed uncertain, at the fundamental level of its own intentions, about whether it was a sincere exploration of its subject or a comedy that happened to be using its subject as material. MacFarlane's later comments on the episode, made in a 2022 interview with The Hollywood Reporter, revisited the controversy without fully conceding the specific criticisms that had been raised. He said there were always things he would do differently when looking back at earlier points in his career, and that for him it was more about nuance than about large structural changes. He said there was no big change he would make to the episode. That position was honest, at least in the sense that it accurately reflected where the show's creative thinking had been in 2010, but it did not engage with the central complaint, which was that the episode had used a trans character as a vehicle for comedy that reinforced rather than challenged the ways trans people were being harmfully characterized in the broader culture. The episode remained in circulation, available on streaming services, and included in season DVD collections, without any edits or removals. Unlike Turban Cowboy, or When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, it was never pulled from broadcast or streaming. The controversy around it did not trigger a network intervention. Family Guy had survived far more organized institutional pressure than GLAAD's criticism and the PTC's complaints, and no single advocacy group's objections had ever resulted in Fox altering its distribution decisions for a specific episode outside of circumstances circumstances involving real-world tragedy. Quagmire's Dad continued to air in reruns and remained accessible on every platform that carried the show's catalog. What the episode left behind in the broader conversation about Family Guy was a specific articulation of the limits of the show's satirical defense. The defense worked when the show's targets were clearly identified, when Peter's ignorance was clearly wrong, when the audience had an obvious way to understand where the joke was actually landing. It worked less well when the satirical framing broke down, when the episode's structure invited the audience to laugh at something without clearly positioning that laughter as critique. Quagmire's Dad was an episode where the show's usual approach, using character ignorance to expose prejudice, was applied inconsistently enough that the prejudice and the critique became difficult to separate. Defenders of the episode saw the satirical intent and found it sufficient. Critics saw the execution and found it harmful. Both readings were responses to real things in the text, which is what happens when a piece of television is genuinely ambiguous about its own intentions. The show's handling of Ida's character in subsequent appearances reflected some awareness of the criticism without explicitly acknowledging it. Ida appeared in later episodes with somewhat more dignity and dimensionality than she had been given in her introduction, though the show never produced a follow-up that directly addressed or revised the choices made in Quagmire's Dad. The character existed in the show's universe as someone Quagmire had accepted, someone the Griffins had encountered and processed in their various ways, and someone the show could return to when the story required it. What the show did not do was revisit the specific scenes and choices that had drawn the most criticism, which remained part of the episode's permanent record, regardless of what came after. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The transgender controversy revealed how the show's satirical framework could collapse under its own weight. The next scandal put Family Guy at the center of American politics in a way no animated show had managed in years. Section 8. The Governor, the Cartoon, and the Voice Actor Who Changed the Story. Sarah Palin had been a Fox News contributor for less than a month when Family Guy handed her a reason to go on television and call the show cruel. The episode that did it aired on February 14, 2010, Valentine's Day, during the same 8th season that had already produced the transgender controversy with Quagmire's Dad. The episode was called Extra Large Medium, and the specific moment that triggered Palin's response was a single line of dialogue delivered by a guest character named Ellen, a teenage girl with Down syndrome whom Chris Griffin asks out on a date. When Chris asks Ellen what her parents do for a living, she tells him her father is an accountant and her mother is the former governor of Alaska. That was the entire joke. 6 seconds of screen time. Palin went on Fox News and called it another kick in the gut. What followed over the next several days was one of the stranger public arguments Family Guy had ever generated, because the central figure in the show's defense turned out to be someone the show's critics had not anticipated. The voice actress who played Ellen was a woman named Andrea Faye Friedman. Friedman had Down syndrome herself, had worked as a professional actress for years, and had appeared in television roles going back to the 1980s, including a recurring part in the drama Life Goes On. She had auditioned for the role of Ellen, been cast in it, and recorded her lines with full awareness of what the episode was doing and what the joke was. When the controversy broke and Palin's response became national news, Friedman decided to speak for herself. Her public statement addressed Palin directly and without diplomatic softening. Friedman wrote that in her family, laughing was considered good, and that her parents had raised her to have a sense of humor and to live a normal life. She then added a line that became the most quoted element of the entire controversy, observing that her mother had not carried her around under her arm like a loaf of French bread the way Palin carried her son Trig around looking for sympathy and votes. The statement was sharp, personal, and structurally inverted the entire premise of Palin's complaint. The argument had been that the show was mocking people with Down syndrome by using a character with the condition as a punchline. Friedman's response was that she was a person with Down syndrome who had chosen to participate in the joke, found it funny, and resented being cast as a victim who needed Palin's protection. Palin had a son named Trig who had been born with Down syndrome during the 2008 presidential campaign when she was the Republican vice presidential nominee. Trig's presence on the campaign trail had been a significant element of how Palin presented herself to voters, and she had spoken publicly and at length about what his birth had meant to her and her family. The connection between Trig and the fictional Ellen was obvious. The episode had not named Palin directly, had not referenced Trig by name, and had not made Down syndrome itself the target of any joke. Ellen was depicted throughout the episode as a fully capable person who goes on a date, has preferences and opinions, and at one point demonstrates that she is considerably better at managing social situations than Chris is. The joke was the line about Alaska's former governor, and the joke's target was Palin rather than Down syndrome. MacFarlane made that distinction clearly in his public response, arguing that the episode was not mocking people with Down syndrome, but was instead using a character with Down syndrome to make a joke about a political figure. His position was that portraying a person with Down syndrome as a functioning, dating, opinionated teenager was more respectful than treating people with the condition as incapable of participating in comedy. The show had cast an actual actress with Down syndrome, had given the character character a full personality and had built the joke so that Ellen was neither the punchline nor the object of ridicule. The punchline was the reference to Palin, which landed on Palin's political identity rather than on anything about Down syndrome itself. Palin's original response appeared on her Facebook page, where she described the episode as cruel and offensive and called on people with good hearts to condemn the content. She then appeared on Fox News in a segment with her daughter Bristol, who had become publicly known during the 2008 campaign and had her own platform by early 2010. The two of them discussed the episode together, with Bristol suggesting that the show had gone after a 5-year-old child who could not defend himself. The framing of the argument as being about Trig personally, rather than about the fictional character or the joke's actual target, was a consistent element of how the Palin response was constructed throughout the controversy. The factual difficulty with that framing was that the joke was not about Trig. Trig did not appear in the episode. His name was not mentioned. The connection between Ellen and Trig required the audience to know that Palin had a child with Down syndrome, which was public knowledge, and to conclude from that knowledge that a fictional teenager with Down syndrome who mentions Alaska's former governor was a reference to that child. That interpretive chain existed, but it was several steps removed from anything the show had explicitly done. MacFarlane and the writing staff had made a joke about Palin's political identity by giving a guest character a family background that pointed toward Palin. Whether that constituted an attack on Trig depended on how directly the fictional character's characteristics were understood to map onto the real child. Bill Maher, the host of HBO's Real Time, publicly defended the episode during the controversy, taking MacFarlane's side and making a similar argument about the joke's actual target. Disability advocacy groups were divided. Some sided with Palin's interpretation, arguing that using a character with Down syndrome as a vehicle for a political joke, even if that character was depicted positively, crossed a line by making the condition itself part of the joke's machinery. Others sided with Friedman's interpretation, arguing that the show had done something genuinely progressive by casting an actress with Down syndrome, writing her character as capable and assertive, and using her in the same kind of pointed political satire that Family Guy aimed at everyone. MacFarlane appeared on Larry King Live shortly after the episode aired, handling questions about the controversy in the careful, measured way he had learned to engage with public criticism of the show. He acknowledged that Palin's feelings about the episode were understandable given her personal connection to the subject, but held firm on his position that the episode was not an attack on people with Down syndrome, and that Friedman's participation and her response to the controversy were both relevant facts that complicated the narrative of the show having done something harmful. The irony of the episode's broadcast context was pointed enough to be worth noting directly. Fox Broadcasting, which aired Family Guy, was owned by the same Rupert Murdoch who also owned Fox News, where Palin had recently become a paid contributor. The episode that mocked Palin aired on one of Murdoch's networks. Palin responded to it on another of Murdoch's networks. The conflict played out entirely within a single media empire that contained both the content and the platform for criticizing it, a fact that seemed to amuse observers on both sides of the argument without changing anything about either party's position. The Parents Television Council, as reliably as it always appeared in these situations, weighed in on the episode and criticized its content, filing a complaint about the broadcast with reference to the episode's overall content rather than specifically to the Down syndrome storyline. Their criticism touched on what they described as inappropriate material for the show's broadcast window, which was the same complaint they made about most Family Guy episodes and which carried the same weight it usually did, which was acknowledged and then set aside. The episode itself was considerably more textured than the controversy around it suggested. The main plot, separate from the Ellen storyline, followed Peter becoming convinced he had psychic abilities after making a few lucky guesses, and building a fraudulent medium business to exploit grieving people who wanted contact with deceased loved ones. MacFarlane had described the episode's underlying message as being about the fraudulence of psychics, a subject he had strong views on. The two storylines ran alongside each other without much intersection, which was the show's standard structural approach, and the psychic plot generated its own comedy, independently of anything involving Ellen or Down syndrome. The Ellen storyline was, in isolation from the political joke, one of the more thoughtful things the show did with a disability-adjacent subject during that period. Stewie helps Chris prepare for his date by coaching him through a song and dance routine designed to build his confidence, a sequence that was purely sweet in its intentions and execution. Ellen on the date was assertive, direct, and unimpressed with Chris's nervousness in a way that made her the more socially competent person in the interaction. The show gave her the kind of characterization it usually reserved for characters who appeared in multiple episodes, which made the choice to use her primarily as the vehicle for a political punchline feel like a genuine missed opportunity for some critics, who otherwise found the portrayal positive. Andrea Faye Friedman's acting career had a history that extended well beyond this single episode, and her response to the controversy was consistent with a public persona she had maintained for years as an advocate for the full participation of people with Down syndrome in professional and social life. She had appeared in films and television programs, done public speaking, and built a career premised on the idea that Down syndrome was not a disqualification from any of the things a working actor does. Her statement about Palin was not a departure from anything she had said before. It was an extension of the same position, which was that patronizing protectiveness, however well-intentioned, was its own form of diminishment. Palin did not respond to Friedman's statement with the same energy she had directed at the show itself. The dynamic of a self-appointed defender being publicly told by the person they were defending that the defense was unwanted and somewhat condescending was not one that lent itself to an easy escalation. Palin made a brief subsequent comment suggesting that she hoped Friedman's remarks were not influenced by the liberal agenda of the producers, an observation that landed poorly with most commentators and effectively ended the productive part of the public exchange. The controversy dissipated without resolution in the way that most Family Guy controversies dissipated, through the arrival of other news and the basic mechanics of the media cycle. The episode continued to air in reruns and was available on streaming platforms without modification. It was eventually noted by disability studies scholars and television critics as a case study in the specific complexities of using disability as a vehicle for political satire, a subject where the intentions of the producers, the participation of the performers, and the reception of the audience could all point in genuinely different directions simultaneously. McFarlane's position that the show had done something progressive by casting Friedman and depicting Ellen as a full person was not wrong. Friedman's position that she had participated knowingly and found the material acceptable was also not wrong. The critics who argued that using Down syndrome as a prop for a political joke, however positively the character was drawn, carried implications worth examining were also not entirely wrong. The episode existed in a space where multiple legitimate readings were available, and none of them fully canceled the others out, which was a more honest description of what the show was doing than either its defenders or its critics usually wanted to acknowledge. What the controversy did expose was how quickly a single line of dialogue could redirect the entire public discussion of an episode away from its actual content. The psychic storyline, the Stewie coaching sequence, the characterization of Ellen as a capable and assertive person, all of it disappeared from the public record in favor of 6 seconds of dialogue about Alaska's former governor. The joke was sharp and deliberate, aimed at a specific political target who had become one of the most prominent figures in American conservative politics. That precision made it more controversial, not less, because it could not be dismissed as accidental or as collateral damage from the show's general irreverence. The show had meant to land the joke where it landed, and it had done so successfully, which was exactly what made the response so loud. Family Guy had spent its entire history generating controversy through content that felt accidental or incidental, jokes that happened to touch on something sensitive, cutaway gags that happened to resemble real events. The Palin joke was different. The Palin joke was constructed, deliberate, and aimed. The show had seen a target, identified a way to hit it, and used a guest character's background to deliver the hit with precision. That intentionality was part of what made Palin's response feel genuinely personal, rather than abstractly political, and part of what made the controversy burn with a specific intensity that the show's more random offenses rarely produced. Friedman's statement remains the episode's most lasting legacy. A woman with Down syndrome telling a former governor and vice presidential candidate that she did not need her protection, and doing so with considerable wit, was a more effective piece of advocacy than anything the show's critics or defenders managed to produce around the same event. The show had made a joke. A real person had turned the response to that joke into something considerably more interesting than the joke itself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Palin controversy burned fast and faded. The next scandal took years to build, involved a rival show that had been on the air since before Family Guy existed, and produced one moment that drew a protest from a national advocacy group before the episode even aired. Section 9. The voice behind the character and the reckoning that changed the show. Mike Henry had been playing Cleveland Brown for 21 years when he sat down to write the tweet that ended his time in the role. He had voiced the character in every season of Family Guy since the show's premiere in January 1999. He had carried Cleveland through 2 cancellations and a revival, through more than 300 episodes, and through 4 seasons of a spin-off series built entirely around the character he had invented the voice for. Cleveland Brown was, in many practical ways, as much Mike Henry's creation as anyone else's. On June 26, 2020, Henry posted a statement saying it had been an honor to play Cleveland for 20 years, that he loved the character, and that persons of color should play characters of color. He said he was stepping down from the role. Henry is white. Cleveland Brown is black. That gap had existed since the first episode of Family Guy, had never been addressed publicly by the show, and had attracted relatively little organized criticism for most of the 2 decades Henry spent in the role. The show's critics had raised concerns about the character's portrayal over the years, and academic analyses had examined Cleveland's characterization with increasing seriousness, but the specific question of whether a white actor should be voicing a black recurring character on a major network series had not broken through into mainstream public debate until the summer of 2020, when the murder of George Floyd and the nationwide protests that followed produced a rapid reckoning across American entertainment with exactly these kinds of long-standing assumptions. The speed of Henry's announcement was striking. striking. He did not wait for a corporate directive, did not wait for Fox to issue a policy, did not make a gradual series of statements before reaching a conclusion. He wrote the tweet and posted it, and within hours the conversation around voice casting and animation had changed in ways that reverberated across the entire industry. The Simpsons made its own announcement the same evening, stating that white actors would no longer voice non-white characters on that show. Jenny Slate had already announced she was leaving her role as a biracial character on Big Mouth. Kristen Bell followed. In the space of roughly 72 hours, a practice that had been standard across American animated television for decades had been publicly repudiated by several of the people who had benefited most from it. Henry's announcement was notable partly for what it did not include. There was no extended explanation, no recounting of how the decision had been reached, no history of the conversations that might have preceded it. The statement was brief and direct, carrying the specific quality of something that had been settled in the writer's own mind before it was communicated publicly. He loved the character and he was leaving. The reasoning was a single sentence. That brevity, in context, was more powerful than a longer statement would have been, because it did not invite negotiation or qualification. The principle was stated plainly and the action followed from it. Cleveland Brown had been part of Family Guy from the very beginning, introduced as one of Peter Griffin's close friends in the show's first season alongside Joe Swanson and Quagmire. The four men formed the social core around which most of the show's male friendship comedy was built, and Cleveland occupied a specific position within that group as the most even-tempered and reasonable of the four. That characterization was consistent across 21 seasons and was, according to critics who examined it carefully, itself a problem. Cleveland was mild-mannered to the point of passivity. He spoke slowly and reacted to provocation with a patience that, read in isolation, could be described as good-natured, but read in the context of how black men were historically caricatured in American entertainment, carried echoes of performance traditions that went back to minstrelsy. The character did not challenge, did not dominate, did not assert himself in ways that created friction. He existed, largely, as a gentle presence whose primary dramatic function was to be reliably nice. Academic critics noted the specific combination of traits Family Guy had assembled around Cleveland and observed that they mapped onto a long history of how black male characters were made palatable to white mainstream audiences in American television and film. By removing the elements of their characterization that might threaten or destabilize, by making them subordinate to white characters in terms of narrative authority and comic aggression, by confining their blackness to surface elements like speech patterns and cultural references, while stripping the characterization of anything more complex. The fact that a white actor was providing the voice for this character was not incidental to those observations. The voice was the instrument through which the characterization was delivered, and the gap between Henry's actual identity and the identity he was performing was the gap that made the character's specific kind of passivity possible in the first place. The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013, was the production's most direct attempt to do something more substantive with Cleveland Brown. The spin-off gave the character his own narrative context, a new city, a new family, a set of supporting characters that were mostly black, and storylines that were ostensibly about his specific experience rather than about his role as a foil to Peter Griffin. The show was co-created by McFarlane, Henry, and Richard Appel, with Henry in the lead as both voice actor and writer. It ran for 4 seasons before Fox canceled it in 2013 due to declining ratings. The critical reception of the Cleveland Show was divided from the beginning. Some reviewers appreciated the attempt to give Cleveland more dimensional material and found aspects of the spin-off genuinely funny. Others were considerably less generous. NPR critic David Bianculli compared the series to Amos and Andy, the radio program that had been one of the most controversial and widely criticized examples of racial caricature in American broadcast history. That comparison was pointed because Amos and Andy had specifically been built around white performers voicing black characters in ways that reinforced demeaning stereotypes, and the Cleveland Show, whatever its intentions, was a production in which a white voice actor played a black character in a series centered entirely on that character's blackness. The parallels were uncomfortable enough that they were raised repeatedly throughout the show's run by critics who found the basic production model difficult to defend regardless of individual episode quality. When Cleveland returned to Family Guy in 2014 after the Cleveland Show was canceled, his character had changed somewhat but retained the fundamental passivity that had always defined him. The spin-off had given him slightly more assertiveness and a broader emotional range, and those traits occasionally surfaced in his Family Guy appearances. But the show's structure did not accommodate that development consistently. Cleveland functioned, again, primarily as the reasonable one in a group of men defined by their specific forms of unreasonableness, and his blackness was invoked most often as the occasion for jokes rather than as a dimension of a person with genuine interiority. The Alex Sulkin tweet from March 2011 belongs in this broader history, not because it was a Family Guy production decision, but because it illustrated something about the culture of the people making the show. Sulkin was, by 2011, one of the show's most senior writers and executive producers. One day after the Tohoku earthquake struck Japan, killing what would eventually be confirmed as over 10,000 people, Sulkin posted a message on Twitter suggesting that that anyone wanting to feel better about the earthquake in Japan should look up the Pearl Harbor death toll. The joke placed the earthquake in a context of historical grievance, treating Japanese deaths as a form of cosmic justice for an attack that had happened 70 years earlier. The tweet was deleted within 24 hours, and Sulkin posted an apology, acknowledging that when he made the joke, the initial death toll had been reported as around 200, and that the true scale of the disaster had not yet become clear to him. His apology noted that by the time he deleted the tweet, the confirmed deaths had risen to 10,000, and he expressed genuine regret for the insensitivity of the original post. The apology was accepted widely enough that the incident did not have lasting professional consequences for Sulkin, who continued in his role at Family Guy and eventually became a co-showrunner for the series. The tweet's significance in the show's broader history is not that it was unique to Family Guy or to Sulkin as an individual, but that it illustrated the specific register in which the show's writers were operating. Dark humor about real tragedies, deployed quickly and without much apparent consideration of the human context, was the show's fundamental mode. The writers who spent their professional lives producing that humor were, apparently, people who also operated that way in their personal communications. The gap between the content of the show and the sensibility of the people making it was smaller than the show's defenders sometimes suggested when arguing that the offensive material was purely strategic and satirical. January 2019 brought a different kind of controversy, one generated not by an episode or a tweet, but by an interview. Executive producers Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin spoke to TV Line about the show's 17th season and were asked whether a joke made in a recent episode, in which Peter Griffin told an animated version of Donald Trump that Family Guy was phasing out gay jokes, reflected an actual production decision. Both of them said yes. Sulkin explained that content the show had felt comfortable making in 2005 or 2006 was no longer acceptable, and that the writers' own views had changed along with the culture around them. Appel said the shift was not about external pressure, but about genuine evolution in the room's thinking. The announcement generated its own complicated response. Some LGBTQ commentators welcomed it as an acknowledgement that the show's history of jokes at gay people's expense had been harmful and that change was overdue. Others pointed out that the announcement covered only gay jokes and left open the question of what the show intended to do about its jokes concerning race, disability, gender, and other marginalized groups. A third group, composed largely of people who had been watching Family Guy for years and had found the gay humor both offensive and unfunny, noted that phasing something out was a considerably more modest commitment than removing it, and that the framing suggested a gradual wind down rather than a recognition that the material should not have been made in the first place. The show's track record in the months following the announcement was monitored by critics who wanted to see whether the stated commitment held. Out magazine, reviewing an episode from season 18, found gay jokes that seemed consistent with the show's pre-announcement approach and ran a piece questioning whether the phase-out had actually begun. Sulkin and Appel did not publicly respond to that specific criticism, and the show continued producing content that its critics assessed differently from its defenders on the question of how much had actually changed. The recasting of Cleveland Brown in 2020 was, in this context, the most concrete and verifiable action the show had taken in response to a representation-related controversy. Henry's decision was his own, made publicly, and the show honored it. The search for a replacement took about 3 months. Arif Zahir, a YouTube creator with over 6 million subscribers known for doing impressions of Cleveland and other Family Guy characters on his channel, submitted himself for the role within hours of Henry's announcement, posting a video of himself doing the voice and framing it as a tribute rather than an audition. The production found him, auditioned him formally, and cast him. He began voicing Cleveland in season 19, which premiered in September 2020. Zahir's approach to the role was shaped by 20 years of Henry's performance. He had grown up watching Family Guy, had spent years studying the voice on his own for his YouTube content, and described Henry as someone whose work he deeply respected. His public statements about taking the role were careful and grateful rather than political, focused on his connection to the character as a fan rather than on the circumstances that had created the opening. He said he would not let the audience down and that he had studied Henry's work extensively. The recasting did not resolve the underlying questions about Cleveland's characterization that critics had been raising for years. The voice changed. The writing did not change in ways that were immediately apparent. Cleveland remained mild-mannered, remained secondary to Peter in terms of the show's narrative hierarchy, and remained the character whose blackness was most often invoked as material rather than as context. The arguments made by academic critics about the show's approach to racial representation were arguments about what the character was written to be, not about who was providing the voice. Those arguments continued after Zahir took the role, applied now to a different actor but to the same characterization. What the recasting did accomplish was a visible acknowledgement by the production that the previous arrangement had been wrong in a way that required correction. Henry's statement had been clear: persons of color should play characters of color. The show had accepted that principle and acted on it. Whether that action extended to the deeper questions about how characters of color were written, what narrative authority they were given, and what assumptions shaped their portrayal remained a different conversation that the recasting did not close. The sequence sequence of events from 2011 to 2020, from Sulkin's earthquake tweet through the phasing out announcement to the Cleveland recasting, traced a gradual process of the show confronting, in fragmented and inconsistent ways, the gap between how it had always operated and how that operation looked when examined seriously. Each individual event was handled on its own terms, resolved or addressed or apologized for, and then the show continued. The accumulated weight of those events, taken together, told a story about a production that had built its identity on the claim that no subject was off limits, while simultaneously making specific choices about who was in the room, who was voicing which characters, and what kinds of humor were acceptable targets that shaped the content as much as any editorial decision ever had. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The recasting changed a voice, but left the deeper questions open. The final scandal closed a different loop entirely, one that had started the night the show was born. Section 10, the night Family Guy killed its most beloved character Brian Griffin, had been in every episode of Family Guy since the pilot. He was the show's moral center, its most articulate voice, the character through whom Seth MacFarlane most openly expressed his own worldview on politics, culture, and the particular kind of liberal intellectual exhaustion that comes from caring too much about things while accomplishing too little. MacFarlane voiced Brian himself, and the overlap between creator and character was something the show acknowledged and played with across hundreds of episodes. Brian read books, drank martinis, harbored literary ambitions that never quite materialized, held political positions that were usually right in the context of the show's value system, and maintained a relationship with Stewie that was the closest thing Family Guy had to a genuine emotional core. 15 years of episodes had established him not as a supporting player, but as one of the 2 or 3 characters around whom the show's identity was built. On November 24, 2013, a Sunday night, Family Guy killed him. The episode was called Life of Brian, and it aired during the 12th season. The setup was casual and unhurried, giving no indication of what was coming. Brian and Stewie set up a street hockey net in front of the Griffin house. Brian goes to retrieve the ball from the street. A car that neither of them heard approaching hits him at speed. The sequence was brief, quiet, and shot without the exaggerated cartoon physics the show normally used for violence. Brian was taken to the veterinary hospital. The Griffin family gathered. He died from his injuries, thanking them for giving him a wonderful life before losing consciousness. The show then moved into its second storyline, in which Peter acquired a replacement dog named Vinny, an Italian-American character voiced by Tony Sirico, best known for playing Paulie Walnuts on The Sopranos. The social media response began before the episode had finished airing on the East Coast. By the time the Pacific broadcast ended, the scale of the reaction was clear. A Facebook page titled "R.I.P. Brian Griffin from Family Guy" accumulated over 100,000 likes within hours. A petition on change.org addressed to Fox and MacFarlane calling for Brian's return gathered thousands of signatures almost immediately and continued building throughout the following week. The petition's language framed Brian as an important part of viewers' experiences of the show, describing him as having added a witty and sophisticated element that the show would lose without him. The petition warned that Family Guy would lose viewers if Brian was not brought back. The online response was not uniform in tone. Some viewers expressed pure grief, the kind of reaction that long-time attachment to a fictional character produces when that character is abruptly removed. Some expressed anger, directed at the producers for making what felt like an arbitrary and punitive creative decision. Some expressed a more analytical frustration, arguing that the show had built enough emotional investment in Brian across 15 years to make killing him a meaningful act, then undermined that meaning by doing it so quickly and moving so rapidly into the Vinny replacement storyline that the death felt like a stunt rather than a genuine narrative choice. The replacement dog was particularly resented, introducing Vinny 2 episodes after Brian's death, before the audience had processed anything about what losing Brian meant for the show, struck many viewers as confirmation that the creative team had not been serious about the death in the first place. MacFarlane spoke about the audience reaction in subsequent interviews with a candor that was itself revealing. He said the response surprised everyone involved in making the show, that they had anticipated some reaction but had not counted on the intensity of what actually arrived. He described it as a good surprise in the sense that the volume of feeling demonstrated how much viewers still cared about the character after 15 seasons, but acknowledged that the rage specifically, as distinct from the sadness, was beyond what anyone in the production had prepared for. The admission that the show had underestimated how deeply its audience was invested in Brian was an unusual kind of transparency for a creator whose public posture was usually one of confident awareness of what the show was doing and why. The replacement of Brian with Vinny was handled with enough care to suggest the production was aware of the risk it was taking. Tony Sirico brought genuine warmth to the role, and Vinny was written as someone who understood that he was filling an irreplaceable space without pretending to fill it in the same way. The character acknowledged his own awkwardness in the Griffin household, formed a specific connection with Stewie that was different from what Stewie had lost, and was written sympathetically enough that some viewers found themselves genuinely engaged with him despite their anger about Brian's absence. The writers were not simply inserting a placeholder, they were attempting something with Vinny. journey, trying to write a character who could exist in the space Brian had left without denying that the space existed. None of that was sufficient to calm the audience response, which continued building through the 2 weeks between Life of Brian and the next new episode. The petition continued gathering signatures. Social media remained active with grief, anger, and speculation about whether the death would be reversed. The show had killed major characters before, or appeared to, and had reversed those deaths in ways that made the reversals feel cheap. Viewers who had been watching Family Guy for years had developed a particular sensitivity to the show's tendency to use apparent, permanent consequences as temporary shock tactics, and Brian's death was being interpreted through that lens from the moment it happened. The Christmas episode that followed, 2 weeks after Brian's death, was titled Christmas Guy, and it brought Brian back. Stewie, devastated by the loss of his closest companion, encountered a version of himself from the past who still had his time machine device. He used it to go back to the moment before Brian was hit by the car and push him out of the way, restoring the original timeline and returning Brian to the Griffin household in time for Christmas. The episode was designed to work as both a resolution to the grief of Life of Brian and as a standalone Christmas special, and it handled the emotional weight of Stewie's loss with more care than the death episode had handled Brian's actual death. The reunion between Stewie and Brian was played with genuine feeling, and the episode's final moments, with Brian restored to the family and the timeline reset, were constructed to be satisfying in the way that the best Family Guy emotional beats could be satisfying when the show committed to them fully. MacFarlane's post-resurrection comment on Twitter became one of the most quoted things he ever wrote about the show. He expressed incredulity that anyone had genuinely thought the production would permanently kill Brian, describing the idea in terms that implied the suggestion itself was absurd. The comment was funny in the specific way that MacFarlane's humor often was, self-aware and slightly dismissive, but it also carried an implicit acknowledgement that the show had manufactured a grief response in its audience and then resolved it in a way that retroactively made the grief feel manipulated. The audience had been sad, then angry, then relieved, and the whole sequence had been engineered by a production that knew from the beginning how it was going to end. That knowledge, or the strong suspicion of it, was at the center of the most sustained criticism the death and resurrection generated. The argument was not simply that Brian had been killed and brought back, which was a common enough television maneuver. The argument was about the specific texture of the manipulation. Killing a 15-year character in a quiet, realistic way, without the cartoon exaggeration that would have signaled comedy, was a choice designed to produce genuine emotional response. The production had asked its audience to grieve something real, using the emotional tools of real loss rather than the distancing mechanisms of cartoon violence. Then it had reversed the death 2 episodes later and made a joke about anyone who had taken the grief seriously. The criticism touched something that Family Guy had navigated imperfectly throughout its entire run: the tension between the show's comedic identity and its occasional attempts at genuine emotional stakes. The show worked best when those two things coexisted without either undermining the other. The Brian-Stewie relationship had been the most consistent example of that coexistence, providing emotional grounding for the show's most chaotic material without ever losing the comedy that made those characters function. Life of Brian and its aftermath disrupted that balance not by killing Brian, which could have been done in ways that honored the relationship, but by killing him in a way designed to maximize grief and then reversing it in a way that minimized the grief's significance. The petition that had gathered signatures in the days following the death became an artifact of something slightly uncomfortable once Brian was back. The people who had signed it had expressed genuine distress about the loss of a character they cared about, and the speed of his return suggested that the distress was exactly what the production had been counting on generating. MacFarlane's Twitter comment, telling those people that the production could not believe anyone had thought it was permanent, was intended as reassurance but functioned as something closer to a reveal. The audience had been played, not maliciously, but deliberately, and the acknowledgement that came with Brian's return made the playing explicit. The change. Org petition remained online long after Brian's return, a minor monument to a controversy that had burned fast and resolved faster than almost any other the show had generated. 25,000 signatures, gathered in the brief window between death and resurrection, represented a specific kind of fan investment that the show's earlier controversies had not produced. The Parents Television Council had filed FCC complaints. Advocacy groups had issued statements. Politicians had gone on television. None of those responses came from the same place as 25,000 people signing a petition to bring back a cartoon dog. The petition was pure attachment, uncomplicated by ideology or regulatory interest, and it demonstrated something about the show's relationship with its audience that the PTC campaigns and the banned episode controversies had never quite reached. Brian's return was followed almost immediately by an episode that seemed designed to test whether the audience would stay angry once the grief was resolved. Herpy the Love Sore, airing just weeks after the Christmas resurrection, placed Brian and Stewie in a storyline where Brian gave Stewie herpes by sharing blood during a bonding ritual without disclosing his condition. The episode was one of the show's more aggressively unpleasant installments, built on extended sequences of a toddler suffering from a painful harmful infection that Brian's carelessness had caused. Critics and viewers who had just been through the emotional whiplash of Brian's death and return found the episode's deliberate ugliness particularly difficult to absorb in that specific context. The show had asked for grief, reversed it, and then almost immediately produced something designed to make the audience feel bad about the character they had just been relieved to get back. The sequence of events across those few weeks, the death, the outrage, the petition, the return, the immediate pivot to something unpleasant, revealed the specific mechanics of how Family Guy maintained its audience's engagement across long seasons. The show could not sustain conventional narrative momentum across 22 episodes in the way that dramas did. Its structure was fundamentally episodic, each installment largely self-contained, connected to the others primarily through character consistency rather than plot continuity. Within that structure, the show periodically needed events large enough to generate conversation and maintain investment between episodes. Brian's death was the largest such event the show had ever produced, and its reversal confirmed that the event had been designed from the start as a conversation generator rather than as a genuine narrative development. MacFarlane's overall handling of the controversy, from the death through the resurrection through the Twitter comment, was consistent with how he had managed every major Family Guy controversy across the show's run. He was transparent about the show's intentions after the fact, defended the creative choices in the moment, and then moved on without extended public reflection. The show continued. Brian continued. The relationship between Stewie and Brian continued to anchor the show's most emotionally resonant material in subsequent seasons, as though the death and resurrection had been a detour rather than a destination. What the whole episode demonstrated, more clearly than perhaps anything else in the show's long history of controversy, was the specific nature of the bond between Family Guy and its audience. Every previous scandal had involved the show producing something that offended, disturbed, or upset people outside the fan base, advocacy groups, politicians, watchdog organizations, rival shows. Brian's death produced something different. It upset the people who loved the show most. The grief that flooded social media in the days after Life of Brian came from viewers who had watched Family Guy for years and had developed genuine attachment to a character that the show had spent 15 seasons building. The production had leveraged that attachment deliberately, used it as material, and then returned what it had borrowed before the audience had time to fully process the loss. The show had been in conflict with the outside world for 15 years. For 2 weeks in November and December of 2013, it was in conflict with itself, or more precisely with the people who had given it enough of their time and attention to feel something real when it took something away. That conflict resolved quickly, as Family Guy's conflicts always did, through the combination of a clever reversal and MacFarlane's instinct for diffusing emotional tension with comedy. But the petition, the 100,000 Facebook likes, the volume of genuine grief that poured out of the fanbase in those 2 weeks, remained as documentation of something the show had rarely made visible: how much the people watching it actually cared about the characters inside it, even after all those years of being reminded not to take any of it too seriously. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.